Hi, Chief Cook. Thanks for being here.
Very nice to see you, Counselor. Hi, John.
Sorry, sorry, Chris. Thanks. How are you?
Nice to see you, John.
Thank you, Kinsey. Same to you.
John, I'm coming back for that tour. I'm sorry when I was out there, it didn't happen.
Oh, I can't wait.
And I see we've got Lynn. Hi, Lynn.
Nice background, Chris.
My favorite landmark, although it doesn't look like this right now. So
No, it doesn't.
That's all right. I think we're definitely, winter without snow is my least favorite season. So I think we're in a good time for imagining others.
Thank you.
Oh, there we go. Hello, everybody. Hi, Kenzie.
Hi, Frank.
Are we ready to get started? Hey, Chris, how are you? Chris Cook, David Leonard, hi. John McColgan, Michael Canizzo. How are all my friends?
How are you, Counselor?
Good, good.
Man,
Kenzie, we
Trying to
ready?
stay
to-
warm.
Yeah, just if we can check with Chief Cook, if everybody's here on his side. I think so.
Chris, you're good to go? And Kenzie, we're not doing both boards together. It's gonna be first panel, second panel, or is just everybody up together? What do you think?
Yeah. So I think it's the two admin panels, and then we'll do questions, and then the two advocate panels, and then questions. So.
Oh, okay.
so
Okay.
just-
Thank you.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
we're kind of.
We'll go
Yeah.
through administration, then we'll get up, then we'll go to the guest panel.
Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna get this started. There's my fake gavel there. For the record, my name is Frank Baker, Boston City Council for District 3. I'm the chair of the Boston City Council Committee on Arts, Culture, and Special Events. I'm joined by my councilors, the lead sponsor, Councilor Bach, Councilor Braden, and Councilor Flynn. I think that's all that we have here for now. This is a public hearing being recorded and live streamed at boston.gov/city council TV. It will be rebroadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN, Channel 82, Verizon Fios Channel 964. We will take public testimony at the end of the hearing, and if you wish to testify via video conference, please email or share to shane.pack@boston.gov to sign up. When you are called, please state your name and affiliation or residence and limit your comments to about 2 minutes to ensure that all can be heard. You may also submit written testimony by emailing ccc.ac@boston.gov. Today's hearing is on docket number 1005 in order for a hearing regarding a Boston Sestercentennial Commission to mark the 250th anniversary of 1776 through inclusive historic preservation and commemoration. And with that, I'd like to turn over for brief opening statements. We'll start with the lead sponsor, Councilor Bach.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I'm so grateful to you and my colleagues, and also to the administration and advocates and the public for joining us today. I grew up giving tours of Boston's historic sites and also did my PhD in history before becoming the counselor for very historic district. So I care quite passionately about our history and about all that history can teach us about ourselves and where we've come from and where we're going. And I'm also deeply aware that historic preservation and commemoration, it doesn't happen accidentally or on autopilot. If you leave it to its own devices, then we lose historic resources. We're particularly likely to lose the history of marginalized communities. And when we lose, whether it's documents in archives or buildings, we're not able to bring them back. And I think that in Boston, we benefit so much from the work that others have done before us to preserve historic resources. But there are also a lot of opportunities for us to do more, and especially opportunities for us to highlight and really include the history of people who have been here and been part of Boston's story the whole way along, but whose narratives have not always been uplifted and centered. And so the purpose of this hearing order that I filed back in September is really twofold. And I just want to explain this before we jump into the conversation. So the Sestercentennial is a fancy name for the 250th anniversary of the country. That's coming up in 2026 from the 1776 date. And the bicentennial in Boston was a real opportunity to highlight a lot of Boston's revolutionary history. It made the Freedom Trail justifiably famous. It drove a lot of tourism to the city. And I think there's an opportunity to do something like that again, but to do it in a way that, like I said, really includes a broader scope. So I think about the fact, I said this in the council hearing, I live down the street from the George Middleton house. George Middleton fought, he was a Black man who built the oldest house left on Beacon Hill, fought in the Revolution, received a flag from John Hancock, and was also one of the first people in this country to fight for equal education rights for Black children. But we only know about his story because of some of the work of the Museum of African American History on Beacon Hill. And they created a Black Heritage Trail. And I think things like the Black Heritage Trail and frankly, the history out in our communities, our neighborhoods across the city, we need to be highlighting that with the 250th in the same way that we really raised up the Freedom Trail at the 200. And I think with intentionality and planning in advance, there's a real opportunity for Boston to lead the way on what this inclusive commemoration looks like. And it's important for us to get started, not just because exhibits and curricula, like the type of things we might want to organize for our public school students and out in our branch libraries, take time, but also because Boston was such a central part of the story leading up to the Revolutionary War that a lot of anniversaries here happened even before that date. So we've already had this year the Boston Massacre commemoration, and we had some great work on making that a broader and inclusive story that we'll hear about today. But we've got the Tea Party coming up, other things. So it's really an opportunity for us from a tourism angle, from a inclusive commemoration angle, to get the ball rolling and to make sure that our Native communities, our Black communities, our women's history is all part of that conversation. That's one piece. The second piece is just that the bicentennial was used by this city as a way to really create a lot of the historic preservation tools that we rely on today. So the Landmarks Commission was created in 1975 in the run-up to the bicentennial. Article 85 in our zoning code, demolition delay, also came out of this moment. But while we were really on the cutting edge 50 years ago, historic preservation tools in other parts of the country have really moved ahead of some of what Boston has in the intervening years. And so the Sestercentennial, the 250th, is also an opportunity for us to really dig in on what are the tools that we need to preserve history in the city, and importantly, to preserve local and community history, which is really not the type of history that our tools were created for. And I'd say Article 85 is something that for a long time has frustrated both the historic preservation and the developer community. So there's a real opportunity to dig in on the legislative side. And in the new year, I'll be proposing more concretely a commission with the opportunity to have subcommittees and sort of have focused conversations separately on those legislative tool angles, and then things like the commemorative events and how we drive tourism and how we set up archive and curricular exhibit support. I think there's a lot of different strands of this conversation, and I'm aware that'll make it a complex conversation today. But really excited to think about this as a decade where we push towards that 250th and then towards Boston's 400th birthday in 2030. And we really embrace the full range of the historic resources of the city and invest in them and in a sense of that history really belonging to all Bostonians. So Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence. Sorry to go on for a little bit there. Those are my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Box. And next is Councilor Braden.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Councillor Bach, for bringing forward this discussion. As a member of the Alston Brighton Historical Society, a newcomer to the neighbourhood, I learned so much about the history of Boston and the history of my neighbourhood through the Historical Society. And we do have a Revolutionary War history out here. The cattle markets in Brighton were the source of meat for General Washington's army, and so we have all sorts of good stories out here about Revolutionary War era events, and I really think local and community history is so very important to our understanding of our place in the world, and how our communities developed, and how newcomers to our neighborhood, to our city, to the country had an impact in shaping the future of our neighborhoods and the city. So combining immigrant history, history of our native peoples who lived in our neighborhoods here, and then the history of African Americans. It's all very important to understand the fabric of who we are and where we're going as a city and as a country. So thank you so much. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Braden. We've also been joined by Councilor Mejia, and next is Councilor Flynn. Councilor Flynn, you have the floor.
Thank you, Councilor Baker. Thank you, Councilor Bach as well. This is really an interesting hearing, and I'd love to be part of it. I know Kenzie is a historian. I consider myself a bit of a historian as well, having majored in history in college, but I love studying Boston history. Just a couple weeks ago, I was at the Coconut Grove 78th anniversary of the fire. And myself and Kenzie share the Boston Common, and probably the most beautiful monument, I think, is the Robert Gould Shaw 54th. But you are right, and Liz Braden is right, and Frank is right. There's a lot of great history in the city that doesn't get told. We have a beautiful Puerto Rican Veterans Memorial in the South End, first one in the country for Puerto Rican veterans. In my neighborhood of South Boston, we have the South Boston Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It was the first memorial built to honor the men from my neighborhood that got killed in Vietnam. At the time, it was very controversial to have it because it was the first in the country, and the country didn't support those returning veterans across the country. But it really started the healing process. So I'm proud to be from South Boston, but I'm also proud to know what those men did, and starting the debate about the importance of treating everybody fairly. I know we also celebrate our immigrant roots, proud immigrant roots, whether they're Irish or they're Haitian or they're Chinese. But there's so many different groups, African American as well. So many people that made major significant contributions to our city, but their history hasn't been told. And if I'm able to play a little bit of a role, I'd love to be part of it. So I want to say thank you to my colleague, Councilor Baker, and my colleague, Councilor Block. This sounds very exciting. I'm glad to be part of it.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Councilor Mejia?
Good afternoon, everyone. Really excited to be here. Thank you to the makers and to the chair for hosting. I am also, my heart is warm. I guess I don't know how to explain what word to use, but it's nice to see and hear my colleagues advocating and fighting for other groups of folks that don't see themselves reflected in history. So to hear you uplifting those experiences as part of this conversation is really heartwarming. I guess that's the word that I was trying to articulate. English is my second language. So anyways, so thank you for that, for uplifting those experiences. And I think as we continue to have this conversation, I'd love to just kind of propose that we think about how do we include Boston Public Schools and students in this opportunity to help students define for themselves what history they want to see reflected in sharing, and what opportunities can we create to partner with our Boston public libraries. Like this is an opportunity to, I know this is a hearing, but I also want to just share that we have an opportunity to think about how we create opportunities for the community to participate in this history making process in a way that is centered in their experiences as well. And I think the last thing that I would say is that, you know, the history has a way of educating people, but I also think that we have an opportunity to tell a different story, one that often is never told, and what could that look like, and centering it in the lives of people who have something to say would be really powerful as well. So I don't know if this is what that conversation is about, but I just wanted to throw that out as an idea for us to consider. And
thank you, Council. Thank you, Councilor Mejia. And I just want to say that being a kid during the bicentennial, that was the year that my father first took us on the Freedom Trail. We saw the Bunker Hill Monument and the Constitution for the first time, Paul Revere's house. It was a really, really good time for me, and knowing what I know now, all the maybe tension that was happening in the city and the country during that time. We were in the middle of busing. We were still able to celebrate the country that we were. With that being said, Kenzie, can you just brief statements? We're breaking this down at 2 points. The first point is going to be, we'll talk about what the city is looking to do to celebrate the 250th anniversary. And the second part was?
Just talking about our historic preservation tools and how the city's thinking about investing in and improving on those.
Thank you, Councilor. And with that, I'd like to invite up the first administrative panel. And we're all here, and I'll just go down the line, I guess. Kate Davis, you're first. How are you, Kate?
Thank you, Councilor. I'm very good. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. As the Director of Tourism, Sports, and Entertainment for the city, I can tell you we're very excited about the Sestercentennial and the planning. The tourism industry has received a devastating blow by the coronavirus epidemic, as you all know, and it's going to take years to rebound. So the commemoration and all the events leading up to it will help in this rebound effort. Ensuring that an equity lens is placed on all programs, we're looking forward to working with Rev 250, which is a program of the Mass Historical Society. It's made up of 45 organizations from across the state and is overseen by a volunteer advisory committee. They're planning commemorations, educational programs, and preservation projects from now through to 2026. I know when we talked to Councilor Bach before this hearing, she was talking about the lasting legacies of the bicentennial in 77 and what kind of lasting legacies we might want for the Sestercentennial. And when I was talking to Jonathan Lane, who you'll hear from later, who oversees Rev 250, he was saying the legacies were like preservation work, scholarship, and waymarking, sorry. And I think we envision similar legacies. There's not one neighborhood in Boston that wasn't affected by revolutionary history. And this is our opportunity to provide education and waymarking so generations to come will be able to learn more about who was involved, particularly those who were underrepresented. So I'm looking forward to working with everyone on this call and happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Councilor.
Thank you. Quick question, Kate. Are you calling it Rev 250?
Yes, like Revolution 250, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And the next speaker is John McColgan. John, you're on mute.
I'm sorry about that. Hello, John McColgan here from the City Archives. Thanks so much for inviting us to this hearing. I think that the City Archives can make considerable contributions to the effort of the commemoration. We were given several topic headings to discuss, and there's three of them that under which the City Archives can make very significant contributions to the effort. How the city has celebrated centennials in the past and with what legacies. Well, the City Archives has records of past celebrations that may provide inspiration for the planning, commemoration, infrastructure, and programming. These celebrations reflected a spirit of inclusiveness that may seem surprising from our perspective today. For Boston's tercentenary in 1930, for example, a committee of 800 men and women working through 50 subcommittees coordinated with the Commonwealth's Tercentenary Commission and other statewide bodies in planning and organization. And our collection that contains tickets, programs, catalogs, brochures, publications, posters, advertising events, and 4 volumes of scrapbooks documenting all types of events and activities relating to the celebration. It also notably includes a time capsule containing a letter from the 1830 Bicentennial Parade Marshal addressed to the 1930 Tercentennial Parade Marshal, and handing down to him a truncheon, which unfortunately has not been located. But the 1930 celebration included not just parades and speeches, but also highlighted art, the arts with the creation of new art for the tercentenary and a variety of musical programs. The city further made concerted efforts to include newly arrived immigrant communities Programs not only highlighted the early history of Boston, but also highlighted the culture and contributions of a wide swath of Boston's ethnic community, including more recent arrivals. Examples include Polish Night in the Common, Highland Music Night, Syrian Night, Norwegian Night, Ukrainian Night, German Night, Lithuanian Night, and so on. And then on September 5th, 30,000 people gathered on the Common for a night of presentations focused on Black history and culture in Boston. The program was arranged by Madam Dorothy Richardson and was gripping in its effectiveness. There was scarcely a sound on the Common when the first tableau was shown, the death of Crispus Attucks, whose monument stands only a few rods beyond. Through the spirituals I'm a rolling, keep me from sinking down. Walk together, children, to the tableau which produced or reproduced the Shaw Monument, showed Harriet Tubman, then Lincoln, and ended with a tableau in which living colored veterans of the Civil War posed. And then came the spiritual Bear Your Burdens, followed by the Star Spangled Banner, and it was an evening long to be remembered, and ended the summer series. The celebrations happened both on the Common and in bringing the celebration, and Franklin Park, bringing the celebrations to the neighborhood. Most programs that happened on the Common were also repeated in Franklin Park. And the musical nights at both venues included evenings of music provided by the Boston Negro Chorus, the Polish Lyra Chorus, the Temple Adath Israel Choir. Also, the history of Boston was brought into the schools at all grade levels. Schools put on pageants and plays, had essay contests, and put on exhibitions about the history of Boston. Boston Public Schools put on a huge pageant about the history of Boston on the Common, attended by 15 to 20,000 people. And the organizers proclaimed that all the pageants of the centennial were centered around 4 ideas. First, that there should be presented visually the history of Boston and the developments in that history, which have stimulated the growth of democratic government throughout the world. Second, that as many varied interests as possible should participate in the programs. Third, that the evening should be of such a character that Boston would demonstrate to itself its latent talent embedded in those arts that are relevant in the worthy dramatic performance in the fine concert. A native art should be at the demonstration of the genius of our foreign-born citizens. Now, the bicentennial commemoration, Boston 200, ran from 1972 to 1976. It's a plan to conduct a celebration. The mayor's office of the bicentennial established the Boston 200 Corporation, a nonprofit agency. In 1972, Boston 200 was organized by 4 program areas. There was one called City Game, which consisted of a series of exhibitions on life in Boston through 3 centuries and thematic exhibits of city life. The theme of this program was "The City is the Exhibit." It was Festival American, which consisted of commemorative events, reenactments, parades, concerts, arts, crafts, and festivals. Then there were neighborhood and community programs which explore and celebrate the histories of Boston neighborhoods and their residents. This program consisted of neighborhood exhibits, booklets written by residents, visible projects, and local preservation programs. And finally, visitor services consisted of programs designed to help visitors navigate the city and bicentennial programs, including informational centers. The city wrote and published neighborhood history booklets about each Boston neighborhood and an additional Black Boston booklet. They also recorded a large volume of oral histories documenting a wide variety of Boston immigrant communities: Chinese, Syrian, Eastern European, Irish, Italian. Black oral histories are an exceptional treasure. They include Melania Cass and Geneva Stewart. We have audio histories and transcripts of the Reverend Richard Owens, the pastor of the People's Baptist Church for 45 years and leader of the Black Ministerial Allowance. Owens marched with Dr. King in 1965 in Boston, served as chaplain to Roxbury District Juvenile Court, and was the first African-American to sit on the board of the New England Baptist Hospital. Wilhelmina Crossan, one of the first African-American teachers in Boston Public Schools, who created the city's first remedial reading program and advocated for Black history education. She was founder of the Aristo Club, an organization of professional Black women who promoted scholarships to Black students. And long before Black History Month, the Aristo Club persuaded BPS to initiate a Black History Week. Dr. Jessie Gideon Garnett, first Black woman to graduate from Tufts Dental School and the first Black woman to practice dentistry in Boston. Estella Crosby, who formed the Boston unit of the Housewives League, an organization active in many major cities from the 1930s to the 1960s, whose goal was to overcome economic and educational barriers to African-American advancement. Roland Hayes, the lyric tenor and composer, one of the first recording artists to break the classical music industry color barrier, along with Paul Robeson and Marian Anderson. So we've been featuring some of these oral histories in our blog for Black History Month, but we're continuing to discover more in the collection. And we're in process of digitizing the transcripts and are looking into digitizing the audio tapes as well. So Boston 200's oral histories and published neighborhood histories form a lasting legacy documenting Boston's diverse neighborhoods and the importance of immigrant women and minority contributions. And they're still used by community members today, and I expect they will be useful for the work of the Sestercentennial. Now, we're also asked to look at what resources and ideas we have for historical exhibits, events, and displays out in the neighborhoods, BPS curricula, strengthening the community archives, etc. The archives holds historical documentation capable of supporting innumerable collaborative initiatives in pursuit of a broad range of narratives exploring the history of Boston's diverse neighborhoods and communities. Important lectures documenting city administration, law and policy, the built environment, public safety, election, schools, desegregation, immigration, demography, and so on may be utilized for any number of such projects. But we're one among many institutions across the city holding community archives, collectively offering vast opportunity for collaborative programming initiatives. BPL, Northeastern, UMass Suffolk, Mass Historical, Schlesinger Library, Historic New England, local neighborhood historical societies, there are too many to name, all have fabulous collections documenting the experience of Boston's communities. Academic public history programs focusing on neighborhood and immigrant experiences such as those at Boston College and UMass can also bring invaluable resources to collaborative initiatives for this commemoration. And also, and finally, recent examples of the city supporting inclusive history and culture. The City Archives has experience providing resources and collaboratively developing ideas and planning for historical exhibits, events, displays out in the neighborhoods, BPS curricula, strengthening community archives, etc. One example is
John, can you bring us home, please?
Yeah, sure.
We have multiple panels. Sorry about that, but we have multiple panelists.
All right, I apologize for going on too long. But I just want to say one more thing, that one of the ways in which this commemoration can produce a lasting legacy for the people of Boston would be to instill in the neighborhoods a passion and curiosity for community history, because community history has practical value for the health of communities. It serves the sustainability, it empowers people to participate in local democracy and active citizenship, and it can result in neighborhoods and ethnic communities understanding and respecting not only of their own historical experience, but also those of their neighbors of other traditions. So by promoting exploration of community past to understand the present, the Sestercentennial commemoration can help build a shared culture and trust among Boston's extraordinarily diverse populations. My apologies, Frank.
No, John, that's okay. I just want to leave room because we have questions and we have a full agenda. Okay. David Leonard, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, councillors. Good to be with you again. Great to see also colleagues from many parts of the city on this hearing call with us today. The Boston Public Library is incredibly supportive of a coordinated effort. We typically do our programming 3 to 5 years out for events and exhibitions and programming on this scale. So we're in good shape and right around the right time. We have become aware that there's already work underway, both statewide and with many organizations, a few of which for whom we have great respect. You'll hear from in the panel later on. So the library would be encouraging of us to engage on this effort, valuing all of the partners who could come together, and that whatever that we are doing as a city would be additive and not duplicative of work underway. Given the library and the city's responsibility to lift up all of Boston's neighborhoods, we look forward in particular to exploring a way to raise up all of Boston's history, in addition to what is often told traditionally, and to do so in a way that celebrates all of Boston neighborhoods, whether they were formerly part of Boston for 400 years ago and earlier or not. We also think this is a great opportunity to, in Councillor Mejia's words, or parallel to her words, celebrate those of us who are immigrants and centering people whose stories are not always told in the dominant narrative. In terms of resources, we look forward to tapping the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library's particular map holdings and their education agenda in partnership with the Boston Public Schools. The maps in particular, as well as many other historical documents in our holdings, allow us to tell stories about the socioeconomic reality of the times and how we celebrate them and learn from them today. And so we look forward to joining in this effort. We are uncertain as to whether a commission, a committee, a working group is the right vehicle, but whatever is decided, we look forward to being part of the project. Thank you.
Frank, you're muted.
Thank you, David. Chris Cook, you're up next. Did we lose Chris? Lynn Smilage.
Chris is back.
Counselor, how
I
are
hope
you?
I said that name right. Oh, Chris is back. Okay,
Thank
Chris,
you.
you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll be very brief. I understand that it's a very ambitious agenda and an important one. So I'll limit my comments to just saying a few things. First off, I'd be remiss if I didn't note the dedication of the preservation staff, the landmarks staff, and the environment department.
I think we've
during
lost sound.
COVID-19 throughout the, sorry?
I'm sorry, we're losing sound, Chris.
Chris.
Sorry, Counselor, is this better?
Yep, there you go.
Thank you very much. So the staff has worked diligently throughout the pandemic, and the city of Boston is very, very grateful for all their work. In addition, we just want to reflect on something that's been reflected on several times already, but the importance of bringing a racial equity lens throughout all of this work to make sure that all stories of the history of Boston as people to recent stories of immigrants coming to this country. And then also we want to check the box of making sure that the preservation goals align with our environmental goals as well. And then also I want to make sure that something as my colleague Kate Davis as well as David Leonard both hit on, that we're not duplicative of other efforts that are already underway for this celebration. With that being said, the Landmarks Commission was established in 1975, as Councilor Brock said, to identify and protect Boston's historic buildings, structures, areas, and sites. Planning agency. So any efforts we can, yep.
I couldn't hear him.
You froze up again on us.
I'll wrap up there, Councilor, and then I'll turn it over to my
No,
colleague.
you can finish. We have you good now. You have anything else?
No, in the interest of time, Councilor, and with the internet connection, I'll leave it to my.
Yeah, you started talking about landmarks, so we have Lynn on next. Lynn, you can talk about landmarks a bit.
I will. Thank you very much. And you did pronounce my name correctly. Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Bach. I'm honored to be here. I have been privileged to serve on the Landmarks Commission for 11 years, and 10 of those years as chair. I also serve on the Fort Point Channel Local Historic Commission and the study committee for the prospective new Highland Park Historic District in Roxbury, which we're excited about. My intent today is to raise awareness of some of the issues that Landmarks grapples with. And when I say Landmarks, I include all the volunteers on all the various commissions, but of course, staff as well. All the issues they grapple with in trying to fulfill their mandate of identifying and protecting Boston's assets. There's a widespread misconception that the Landmarks Commission has a lot more authority than it has. We can't wave a magic wand and save a building as much as we would like to. There are 3 primary tools that we use to protect our built heritage. These tools were mentioned earlier. They were put into place in the 1930s. I'm sorry, more than 30 years ago. Not quite that old, but they no longer meet the city's needs. So I'm going to describe each tool just as quickly as I can, and then the challenges to its effective implementation. First tool that's very important are the local historic districts that we have. We've got 9 of them in Boston: Beacon Hill, Back Bay, St. Botolph, Bay Village. Buildings in these districts are totally protected, and any changes that are made to their exteriors have to be approved by their respective commissions. Local historic districts are very powerful tools. They really work. And there's demand in Boston. There has been demand for a long time for more. Neighborhoods have been asking for them in Dorchester, Charlestown, Chinatown, the North End. And a lot of this demand is driven by the epidemic of teardowns that have been happening across the city and the concurrent loss of character in so many neighborhoods. Challenges to any additional landmarks districts. Staff doesn't have the capacity or the resources to establish or administer any new districts, unfortunately. Our second important tool is landmarking individual buildings. There are about 100 Boston buildings that have been landmarked officially. These buildings are also totally protected, so any changes that are made to the exteriors and some of the interiors, for instance, part of the Boston Public Library has an interior designation. Those changes have to be approved by the Landmarks Commission. This works well, but for a very limited number of buildings. Our goal is to landmark buildings in Boston that are meaningful to our many communities. The biggest challenge to this is that the bar is too high for Boston landmarks. The legislation requires buildings to have significance, not just in Boston, but beyond. So this limitation makes it very difficult to achieve equity across neighborhoods by recognizing structures that are important in their communities. And the process of landmarking is lengthy and labor intensive. Staff lacks resources and capacity to manage the process proactively. So every other building in Boston that isn't included either in an historic district or individually landmarked is thus vulnerable. Now we do have one stopgap measure, and that's the Article 85, the Demolition Delay Ordinance. So if a building owner has applied to demolish a building that is not protected, it's assessed for its historic significance first by staff and then by the Landmarks Commission. And if the commission determines that the building is historically significant and should be preserved, can impose up to a 90-day demolition delay. This tool needs a major overhaul. It's largely a waste of time and effort and is currently designed and implemented. A number of challenges with Article 85. 90 days is far too short. It almost never saves a building. In the best of cases, it raises public awareness. Hearings typically take place far too late in the development process, often after the project has obtained all its other permitting. The process offers no predictability to owners and developers who end up frustrated, and advocates who devote time and energy trying to save a building that will invariably come down in 90 days also end up very frustrated. And staff devotes an inordinate amount of time processing these complex demolition delay applications that in the end result in very little, if anything. There's a fourth tool that we don't have yet. This is essential. However, the good news that this is on the horizon, and that's a citywide preservation survey or inventory. We're hampered by a lack of grasp on our city's historic assets. We need a comprehensive and robust inventory that identifies and documents all the historic structures in every neighborhood. Data that the department is working with now is woefully incomplete, and most of it more than 30 years old. This is crucial data that informs almost all of the work it does every day, along with the work of the Community Preservation Committee. So I will end with my perspective as a volunteer on the fundamental issue here, and that is that Landmarks lacks the capacity, the tools, and the resources required to fulfill its mandate to adequately serve our city, a city that hangs its hat on its history. So I appreciate this hearing. I appreciate that this hearing has allowed us to bring attention to the situation, and I look forward to how we might fix it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Michael Canizzo, you're up next. Michael,
Thank you, Councilor. Thank you, all other councilors. I don't necessarily have prepared remarks. I'm currently up at the BPDA, also alum of the Environment Department, and worked with the Landmarks Commission and all the district commissions before I moved up to the BPDA. So I think today I'm probably going to be more of a resource. The demo delay ordinance, for example, was created 25 years ago. So I have a decent memory, but not that good that I can go into all the details on things. But I'm here to say that I'm here to provide any information I can about my memory of working with the commission, creation of the Article 85. I would also want to say I agree with a lot of comments that Lynn made earlier. I think some of those observations have had over the years. And also to say that the BPDA, at least the urban design department, has been working very closely with Roseanne and her team on reviews of not only demolition delay applications that come forward, Article 80 projects, various Board of Appeal projects. We also have been meeting regularly with some of the panelists who will come at later. We meet regularly with Greg Gaylor and his organization to make sure that there's open conversation and dialogue between us and the various preservation organizations so we can work better and address a lot of the issues that we're seeing in terms of buildings coming down and new construction going up. So I'm here to be a resource and work however I can with various committees. Thanks.
Thank you. And we'll go to questions now in a minute. I just have one quick question, then I'll kick it over to Councilor Bach. Michael, how does like Article 80 and things like that, how does that tie in to the bicentennial celebrations? Were those conversations around the centennial? Is that what drove us to set up Landmark and things like that?
Councilor, that's my understanding. I don't think Article 85 came much later from when the Landmarks Commission was created back in 75. And Article 80, which is the review process that the city goes through for projects large and small, or basically projects from 20,000 square feet and above. So that I don't think has any correlation with the creation of the Landmarks Commission.
So was Landmarks Commission, was that set up based on conversations that happened during the bicentennial?
That's my understanding, and I think most people know that actually the Landmarks Commission was created up through the BRA at the time, and then eventually got moved to a separate city department. So I think that was probably, again, I wasn't around back then, why the Landmarks Commission was created. But I would guess it was probably to support the bicentennial.
Thank you. Kenzie, I'd like to pass it over to you for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Baker. And yes, I have a grandfather who was involved back then. I was not myself alive. And my impression is that very much when it came to the bicentennial, these conversations went hand in hand about how to celebrate, but also how to, as we discover, oh, there's all these sites and all these important aspects of history, right? How do you create the tools for the city to celebrate and preserve them? So I think that's sort of the genesis behind connecting these two conversations today. And I really appreciate the administration, everyone for showing up and all of those thoughtful comments. I'm so excited, John, about all of this information from the past centenaries. And I spent a lot of time in archives myself, so I have a million questions I would ask you, but I'll save them for non-hearing times. I guess 2 questions, so one for kind of each panel. One is just really sort of for Chief Cook. I wonder if you could just speak to, I mean, I think what I hear from Michael and from Lynn is kind of the need for us to look again at Article 85. And then also, I think I remember that that you all had actually filed a change to the landmark state legislation, or suggested one, related to this question of how we preserve community and local landmarks. And I just wondered if you could just speak a little bit to the city's willingness to, as part of this conversation, look at those legislative tools and updating them, and also to kind of think about that preservation planning and surveying. And I also want to give you the opportunity to say, I hope your internet connection is back, just that obviously in the last couple of years, the city's made a major new investment in historic preservation through the Community Preservation Act. So I just want to appreciate that today. So that's my question for that panel. And then I have one for the other.
Thanks, Counselor. I'll be brief, and I'm actually going to keep my video off. Hopefully that'll help with the internet connection. You know, just very quickly, the background of Article 85, it was added to the zoning code in 1995. The stated, when we're talking about history, it's important to add the first 2 years of the year. So 1995, the stated purpose was to establish a predictable process for reviewing requests to demolish certain buildings in order to, you know, establish an appropriate, or what was deemed as an appropriate, waiting period during which the city and the applicant can propose alternatives, you know, relating to the architectural, the cultural, the urban design value to the city. But then it was also supposed to provide an opportunity for the public to comment on the issues regarding the demolition of a particular building. And then, of course, there was the overwhelming desire to minimize the number and the extent of building demolitions where no immediate reuse of the site is planned. What's important to note is our director, Roseanne Foley, always points out that there was advocacy from Dorchester residents, and changes were implemented 10 years after, in 2005, to actually strengthen that community outreach component by requiring community meetings for all significant properties to discuss alternatives to demolition. So as recently as 2017, the Boston Landmarks Commission, and certainly Chair Smilage might be more appropriate to talk on this, began to post publicly all demolition applications online and request residents' input. Up to this point, staff could sign off on demolitions for non-significant properties, or what was deemed as non-significant properties, without any public notice. I think what's important through all that is you've seen that there's an evolution of Article 85, and it probably needs to go through another iteration. You know, to Chair Smilage's points, if it's not keeping up with the volume, it's not keeping up with the intention, and it's not making communities, developers have a predictable, navigable path through the city processes, then it's not serving anyone well. So I think you do have a willing partner with the administration to develop coherent changes that best serve not only our preservation goals, but also our sustainable development goals. Chair
Great.
Smilage, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, Chris, I think you covered it all.
Great. Well, that's great to hear. And I think also this, and am I right about Landmarks having filed or drafted something about the state legislative change?
I don't think that happened.
Okay. All right. So then I just saw something. I don't remember what it was, but am I right in thinking it would be like a couple of words we'd need to change in order to bring community or local landmarks into the circle? Is that right?
Yes. Just language that occurs in a few places. Yes, very subtle, but extremely significant.
Great, thank you. And then, and I'm going to try to keep my questions brief because I know we've got a lot to go through. On the first panel, I just want to echo everyone's mentioned, we're going to hear from Rev 250 later on. There's definitely a statewide effort around this, and I think we want to plug into them. I actually think that Rev 250 has been pushing for a statewide commission that's official precisely as a funnel for federal funds. And I think that similarly, there's a real benefit to the city for creating an official group here as another channel to officially liaise with the state commission and to think about kind of federal support for the Sestercentennial. So I think it should 100% be additive and not duplicative. And I guess one question I had and this might be for John or anybody, but it seems to me that there should be an important trans-temporal aspect to this celebration. And what I mean by that is the story of liberty that we tell when we talk about the revolution and the ways in which we complicate it and see how it didn't mean liberty for all people, then have these echoes down through the generations through other social movements. And I've been really encouraged by learning recently about just how much community archive work, like you alluded to, John, is going on in the city and sort of movement history all through the 1800s, 1900s. And I think we definitely are going to want to be able to tie that in and create opportunities in curriculum and such for people to see themselves in all of these echoes and narratives. And so I just wonder, it sounded, John, like, am I right in saying, like, you were saying that was also in these past centennials, we've also done that. We've told the revolutionary story, but we've also sort of jumped to those other aspects of Boston and American history, not just been sort of focused in the late 1700s only. Is that fair?
Yes, it is. We were struck by how much attention was given in these celebrations to minorities, to immigrant groups, particularly in 1930. In 1976, there is this extraordinary collection of oral histories of African Americans, famous African Americans. There's so much there for a community such as the Black community to look at in terms of the heritage and what to be proud of in their heritage and in their past. And yes, I think that the exploration of these of community history is terribly important to the communities themselves, to their social health and welfare. And I would hope that the commission would push for encouraging communities to explore their own history.
Great, thank you. No, I really appreciate it. I think that's so exciting. And I think the opportunity to combine that with this effort to draw tourists and visitors to the city and to all parts of the city and think about, I know Philadelphia has been more successful in the past in really turning these into major events for investments in their historic resources and drawing federal resources and kind of making it a moment that everybody really feels. So I think we should be aiming to do that in Boston in a big way. But those are my questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Also, if I may add, in response to something Councilor Mejia raised, one of the projects that we've had underway in the past year is a neighborhood history project in the Boston Public Schools. We've worked with English classes at Jeremiah E. Burke High School and the Edward Kennedy for Health Sciences to connect Boston's public high school students with the records documenting the history of their neighborhoods. And students used archival resources about their local neighborhood to write a neighborhood history that was part of a year-long project exploring issues in the neighborhoods. And our reference archivist went into the high school classrooms, gave instructional sessions on researching local history using primary sources and archival tools. And this collaboration between BPS teachers and archivists empowered the students to learn about their local history and take ownership of their community history. And similar successful collaborations have been done between Northeastern University Archives and Boston Public Schools. And indeed, we built off Northeastern's experience when we started working on this. So this is one of the ways, and the commemoration can produce a lasting legacy to the people of Boston. to instill in the neighborhoods a passion and curiosity about community history.
Thank you, John. Council Bach, earlier in exchange with Lynn, you were talking about language changes. Would that be language to legislation that we would need to change? Standing legislation? I didn't quite get it.
Yeah, so the Landmarks Commission, as Mr. Canizzo alluded to, the idea for it came up through the city and through the BRA, but it was created through an act of the state legislature.
Mm-hmm.
So the language that only lets landmarks protect things of like national or state, like larger than local significance, is actually state law. So there's two different things. There's Article 85, which we could work on as a community, process with all the stakeholders here in the city, because that's in our city zoning code. And then there's the Landmarks Commission legislation, which is actually state legislation. So that would have to be like a home rule or something that we'd send up. Yeah. And I think it literally is like, to give yourself some scope for having that community landmarks conversation, you'd literally have to sort of change a comma to an and or something. Like, it's a very small change, but it would be quite significant for what their scope can be.
And we would have to do that through home rule if we wanted to do it in the city council. Okay, absolutely. Thank you. Councilor Braden.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. To Councillor Bach's point, I think it might be worth investigating whether putting that comma or that and in there would help. A home rule petition to add a comma and an and to a state law might move the ball for us. That would be helpful. Is there any possibility that we can increase the period demolition delay to a year? I hear this over and over again, and there's so many instances of occasions when buildings have been demolished in our neighborhood that 90 days, you barely know that the thing's going to come down before. 90 days is such a short period of time to mobilize and investigate and all that, especially if you've got limited resources. So for the landmarks folks, has that been explored, and what do we need to do to increase the duration of the 90-day demolition delay?
12 months is kind of the standard across the state, or at least goal across the state, because these are all adopted by individual communities. Some communities have 18-month delays. So yes, 90 days is not effective, and absolutely that's been at the top of our list in terms of conversations that have taken place. I would say over the last 5 years, we've had a lot of conversation. We established a subcommittee to talk about, how we might improve Article 85. So that would be hugely helpful. Yes, 12 months.
I think we might have our marching orders, Councillor Bach.
Councillor, the only other thing I would add is that we have an incredibly dedicated staff, as well as a citizen volunteer commission as well. They have a limited amount of time. They have a limited amount of resources, and Article 85 demolition, given the pace of development in the city, takes up a lot of their time. And so when you start looking at, only having 10 days to review, some of these applications at the staff level, I think there's a desire there to increase that review period of time. And then also just inserting Article 85 earlier into the overall process before you consider, increasing the delay of time. Can you look at incorporating it early into the city's other processes, and then, coordinating with ISD and ZBA as well? So there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration.
Yeah, I think it's worth exploring.
Councillor, I want to add one thing, and I hope I don't get in too much trouble. I think if we are going to be looking at Article 85, besides the length of time, when it was created, it was meant more to be a pause in the process to allow the community an opportunity to talk to the developer to see if there's any other alternatives, for the commission to explore any alternatives to demolition. So I think there was but there was never a hook at the end of the process to require the applicant to come back to the commission to report on any progress. So I think that would be something else I would suggest that we look at. And the other thing, which may be controversial, but is whether or not Article 85 should remain in the zoning code, because anything in the zoning code can be appealed through the Board of Appeals. And I think we've already had at least one case not too long ago where the applicant went to the Board of Appeal and got the zoning Board of Appeal to overturn the commission's decision. So I think that's probably a hidden piece that needs to be explored further. I think the length of time is one thing, requirement people to come back, but I think the other thing is what's the best place for Article 85, or I should say demolition delay, to be, whether it should be part of zoning or maybe the city ordinance or another avenue that would maybe protect the commission's decision.
There's lots to think about there. I think, you know, I really feel, having been involved in some of these campaigns to try and preserve some buildings or whatever, I think it's definitely something we need to look at. Oh, the other issue I wanted to raise up, we mentioned many groups in this discussion, but I think the other group that's under-recognized is the history of women in Boston. I know that we had a presentation at our Historical Society a few years ago about the absence of statuary and memorials to the contributions of women. It's not a total absence, but it's very much out of underrepresentation of women in the history of Boston. So I'll be campaigning to have raise the profile of women and the contributions that they have made to the city of Boston as well in this celebration. So those are my 2 comments for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Braden. Councilor Mejia.
So thank you. I feel like every time I come to these hearings, I always learn a lot. So happy to be here, and I've been taking notes. So I just have 3 questions, and one is actually 2 questions and then just a comment. I just want to uplift that I didn't hear anything around Indigenous Native Americans, like in terms of as a group that we need to think about within this historical bicentennial situation here that we're talking about. So, you know, we're standing in borrowed land, right? Or land that we took. So just want to make sure that that history is reflected in this conversation, and that when we're thinking about how we honor that we think about those, that group of folks that I didn't hear anyone mention. And I think it's important to just uplift it. And if somebody mentioned it and I missed it in your opening remarks, sorry, but I'll just say it one more time just in case, to underscore the importance of it. So I'm curious about, so I'm new to this whole I came to this country in 75, so I don't even like, and I did not do good in history, so I'm struggling with a lot of this conversation. But when you talk about history, what time period are we considering for the next, because I just learned this in the next 5 years. So are we gonna be documenting history of things that have happened in the 70s, or are we just gonna go back to all the history that we've been told? Like, I need some, Councilor Bach, I need to understand, when you think about history and celebration, I wanna know what history, what time frame, what decade. Are we just recycling other old things? I don't know, I need some clarity on that. Because if we are gonna look at old history that has happened since I've been in this country, I think that the history of the fact that, you know, the entire city of, not all history is beautiful. Having survived the busing era here in the city of Boston, I think there is some history there to document and to archive and to share and to tell and to learn from in terms of that journey. So I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but I just feel like history is truth. And if we're going to be honest about documenting history, then I think the whole entire history needs to be told. if this is a space for it. I'm curious to know what organizations have been engaging in the process. I heard that there were lots of organizations. I don't know who, I don't know where they're from. Just give me a general snapshot of the diversity right now. I'm not looking through all the tiles, but I don't see a lot of diversity here. So I don't know. I got one more question. Do you want me to say it or do you want to talk? Yeah, okay. And then this is more of an idea that we should do a scavenger hunt, like a historical scavenger hunt as part of the project. And if we're doing something in collaboration with the schools and the neighborhoods and the libraries, I feel like we could do something fun. I don't know what that looks like. I probably won't even be working with the city 5 years from now, but I would go to the scavenger hunt if you guys, if we do something that's more engaging, and if COVID goes away and we can convene and do like a citywide historical scavenger hunt, that would be a fun way for us to learn about the history. And then that's just the bicentennial questions. And then I have a question for landmarks. There are a lot of neighborhoods that don't know about this Historical Preservation Act and ways that they can protect buildings. And I just am curious about, like, Melina Cass, let's just say, for example, she lived in Roxbury, I believe. Could her home be considered a historical preservation situation? Like, how are we just looking at when you think about historical preservation, is it just within a period of history that has been defined as relevant, or are we looking to expand that language to include most recent history that my daughter will learn about, hopefully in her own textbooks at some point? I'm just curious.
So do we, I don't know, do we want to break that down? Does anybody want to answer the first part of that? And then we can get into the landmarks question after. Whoever on the panel wants to
Counselor, it's Chris Cook. I apologize again for not having my camera on, but just because of connectivity issues, I'd like to keep it off, and hopefully that'll work better. Is it okay to touch briefly on a few subjects that Counselor brought up? All right, thank you. So Counselor, I think you bring up a really strong point. One is, when you take arguably one of the more important landmarks in the city, Boston Common itself, often we celebrate its incorporation of 1634 as America's first public park. But to your point, Counselor, the history of indigenous people go back much, much further, even in places like Boston Common. Our city archaeologist, Joe Bagley, has discovered evidence of Native American peoples going back on Boston Common since before the time of the pyramids. And so as you start celebrating the full history of Boston, it is going to be very important coming up on these anniversaries that we are as inclusive as possible. And I know some of that representation will be advocated for in the other panels on this. As it relates to the landmarking as well as the community preservation efforts, obviously we would want to make every effort to engage with any communities that had any desire to learn more about these opportunities, whether it's access to community preservation funds or access to the landmarks process itself. But I think we have to be really honest that the current landmarks district themselves do reflect especially some Eurocentric history, but there's been some strong efforts made recently to change that. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Lynn Smilage from the chair to maybe highlight some of those opportunities and add some other comments.
Thank you, Chris. Well, the most recent example probably is the Highland Park Historic District that we hope to launch soon in Roxbury. But as I said earlier, there's been a great deal of interest from many other neighborhoods in Roxbury and Dorchester and elsewhere, East Boston, Charlestown, for many years to establish historic districts there. Again, it's just, do we have capacity to create them and administer them once they're in place? You mentioned Melania Cass. Malcolm X's house, for example, is a Boston landmark. And typically a landmark application emerges from the people in the neighborhood. People who care about a building are often the ones, or usually the ones, to initiate the process by putting together a petition and submitting it. But I think staff has done a terrific job in communicating throughout Boston with a lot of tools that didn't exist until a few years ago, with a newsletter, and they're very active on social media. So I think that's one way of getting the word out that these opportunities are there. But we really like the petitions to come from the community, the people who really care about a building.
And then in addition to that, Counselor, just some projects where the native tribe of the Massachusetts have been directly engaged are the First Church of Roxbury, the Stone Living Lab in Boston Harbor, Boston Common itself, and then any other project that we can find that will be as significant to just on that specific issue that you brought up. Thank you. Sorry, Counselor.
That's okay. And Councilor Mejia, I think this one part of your question was around programming and what the celebration is going to look like. I think our second panel is going to speak to that. Correct? Councilor Bach, can you correct me if I'm wrong there?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I really appreciate Councilor Mejia bringing up the Indigenous and Native communities. The North American Indian Center of Boston's joined us on the next panel, along with the Museum of African American History. And I think talking about how those commemorations can be really inclusive is an important part of this. So they're on our next panel, which I think we're getting to right after this.
Yeah, but so I guess, Mark, who answers the question around the timestamp, the historical, Councilor Bach?
And well, sure, I'll say just a word to that, which is so two things. One is that I think what John McColgan was saying is that even though it's the 250th anniversary of 1776, as a reference back to that revolutionary history moment, because it's also the birthday of the country, it's always been considered a moment to talk about the whole sweep of our history. And then to your point about telling the stories that are less good, right? The harder parts of our history. I agree. I think that's really important. And I think actually there are really strong resonances. I mean, I mentioned in my opening comments that George Middleton was one of the first advocates for equal education for Black children around 1800. So here you've got a Revolutionary War guy who's pushing for that. But ultimately, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court back in the early 1800s said that separate but equal education was fine. And so we have both the first Black public school in the country on Beacon Hill, and also quickly it becomes the basis for the legitimacy of segregated education. And that's actually the basis. That decision was what Plessy v. Ferguson upheld before you got Brown v. Board of Education in '54. So I think you're 100% right, Councilor Mejia, that all of our stories that we tell, they resonate through history, and often they resonate. It's not always positive resonances. So I think it's a chance that's to me why it's so important for us to use this moment to improve all of our historical tools, our archives, our preservation legislative tools, because we've got to take a really wide lens on our history.
Yeah, I would like to support that and to express my appreciation of Councilor Mejia's questions, especially the idea, are we going to recycle the old history? Or history is not static. History is a wonderful tool for understanding ourselves, for understanding the past, and there are so many institutions out there, so many resources out there, archival resources, institutions that provide the resources for the experience of all the communities of Boston. And this can bring tremendous health to the local communities if people know what their own history is. So we would advocate that there would be collaboration among all the archival institutions in Boston to research and explore community history. and come up with fresh perspectives. So it's not something that's static. There's always something new to be learned about our past and our history. And I think this is a tremendous opportunity to do that.
And Councilor Baker, just so I can put a button on my understanding of this conversation. So everything that we're talking about right now, we're not going to see until 5 years from now, and we're just going to be planning it. So help me understand what how's this going to move?
Can I quickly, Councilor Baker?
Yes. Yeah.
So basically a couple of things. So basically one thing is that on the revolutionary side, there's a bunch of anniversaries we have before 1776. So like we had the Tea Party here in Boston, that would be like in 23, like there's a bunch of those. But the other thing is that the stuff, a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, like improving these historic preservation tools, things like you were talking about with BPS curriculum, or like the archives doing big exhibits, or like even planning something like a scavenger hunt in a like serious, exciting way, right? Those things actually take multiple years to do well. So I think the idea would be that some of these, you need to start like now in order to have really great stuff when you come to 2026. But the other thing is that you also want to be building excitement, right? So you want to do things like we want to, on the tourism side, right? Kate Davis mentioned, we've been totally, our tourism sector has just been devastated by this pandemic. Like it would be great if we drove a ton of people to come to Boston in the years leading up to the 250th, and we really made everybody feel over the course of that, like, oh, Boston's going to be the place to be that year in 2026, right? So it's a ramp up for 5 years, but it's not nothing and then everything in 5 years.
Okay. And I'm so sorry that I've monopolized this entire conversation, Councilor Baker, but I just want to be thoughtful and I want to be helpful in the conversation so that it's, if I can understand what I'm here to do and speak on. So then the last thing that I was saying, this is it, you're going to move on to the next panel, is that in regards to the tourism situation, is that because we're the birthplace of education and we're the birthplace of parks, which I didn't even know that was also something that was fascinating about Boston, is that we can also target very specific industries and maybe even host a conference here around education and bring educators from all across the country here to really convene and celebrate and talk about issues of education, right? So I'm an ideas person. I'm just giving y'all things to think about and ways that we can bring people into the city in ways that is connecting to what the celebrations are about and what we are known for. And that is it, I swear.
Yeah, so that would be, I think, in programming, which we're going to be talking about in this next panel, ideas. So this next panel will be the people that will bring ideas to, if communities have ideas, let's do this for a celebration and whatever, fill in the blank. So that's what I'm hoping this next panel speaks to, is what the celebrations will look like.
I would just add one comment on the dates. I mean, we're using the historical dates, it sounds like, to be a trigger for celebrating all of Boston's history and an inclusive history. But in some ways, the first of those big dates, was the arrival of the Mayflower. Not that there wasn't history before that needs to be celebrated in some way, but that's this year. That's what the arrival in Provincetown and Plymouth. And so from there to the Tea Party in 23, to the birth of the country in 76, through to Boston's own history in 2030. So there is a 10-year arc to this decade that we're in, where not that we could do something tomorrow, but as we're ready, the entirety of this historical period could be seen as valuable. And so we don't have to wait for 5 years, but maybe we have to wait for 2 or 3, and then continue on, even though the subject of this hearing is specifically on the 76th anniversary.
Thank you, David. Are there any further questions from councilors? Okay, thank you. And you guys do not need to stay for the second panel, but you're welcome to. I have someone raising their hand here. I'm not. So I would like to call up the second panel now. Jonathan Lane, Nathan Shedley, Leon Wilson, Jean-Luc Perret, Greg Gaylor, Kathy Gododaris, Leslie Reed, and Brianna Groshek. Did I get that? I hope I got everyone's name there. And I guess, Jonathan, you're first. You can start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Councilor Bach for putting this hearing together, and to all of you who are here in support of promoting this upcoming commemoration. And I work for Revolution 250, which is a program administered by the Massachusetts Historical Society. Originally, of course, MHS was known as the Historical Society, having been essentially built around the idea of preserving the history of the American Revolution in Boston. And we actually have more than 60 organizations across the Commonwealth and beyond that are part of this commemoration. And we are tied into establishing a statewide commission that would focus on the upcoming commemoration and making sure that all communities throughout Massachusetts feel a part of the commemoration, and to make sure that we touch on many of the ideas that Councilor Mejia spoke to in particular. We are also working with and in connection with the National Semi-Quincentennial Commission, known as America 250. This was established by President Obama and staffed in the last 4 years. And they are meeting in Philadelphia. By law, they have to meet in Philadelphia. And they are working on the national narrative of this commemoration, which for national purposes is looking beyond the events of the American Revolution and encompassing really the last 250 years of American history. We're also connected with US 250, which is a committee of the American Association for State and Local History, and they are acting as advisors to the National Commission on ideas and programs surrounding the national celebration of the United States. For Revolution 250, we're really focused on 3 particular areas, one of which is commemoration. So making sure we hit the marks that people expect. We don't want to disappoint people who are really looking forward to tossing tea in the harbor in 2023, or in the battles of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill and the Evacuation Day 2026. I imagine the people of Boston will be fairly exuberant. But at the same time, looking at education and preservation. And preservation, I will say, looking beyond not just the thousands of historic structures across the Commonwealth that are in need of saving or restoration or care or reinterpretation or better waymarking, but also looking at ways to preserve and make available documentation. A lot of the information about these underrepresented peoples that have particularly come to light since the bicentennial come about because scholars have become more active in searching out little-known archives, which for the people of Massachusetts represents not just the state archives or the city archives, both wonderful institutions, but every community across the Commonwealth is an archive of this historic material. And so, for instance, Mass Historical Society, I know, just received a grant to digitize records of the overseers of the poor for the city of Boston and Charlestown and Roxbury, I believe. And again, that's a wonderful opportunity to begin to come to grips with some of the underrepresented voices of this time period, and definitely some of the underserved populations. So finding ways to preserve and make available historic documents or town documents throughout Boston and the Commonwealth in generally. And then as far as education is concerned, just to touch on this particular aspect of it, we have been very engaged with the Massachusetts Council on Social Studies. We've run summer seminars for the last 2 summers, specifically focused on underrepresented voices of the American Revolution, finding ways to take the new information that's being found by scholars and put it in the hands of K-12 educators across the Commonwealth. In 2024, the National Council on Social Studies will be coming to Boston. And again, we're looking at finding ways to engage both scholars and K-12 on a national scale to bring this underrepresented stories to the classroom. Tied into that also is a combined joint hosted, forgive me, I'm having a senior moment, conversation in 2022, a conference that will involve scholars who are looking into the roles of African Americans, Native Americans, women in particular, who had a driving force in promoting domestic manufacture and non-importation agreements as a sign of protest in the 18th century. A lot of people aren't aware of the role of Native Americans in the siege of Boston, that, almost 12 months of siege that took place, and it really involved every community throughout the city. So we have Native Americans from both the Mashpee and the Aquinnah Wampanoag, the Hassanamisco Nation, the Natick peoples, and also the Stockbridge Mohican, now the Stockbridge Munsee tribes. And so there's a lot of wonderful stories there that, again, have gotten short shrift historically that we are looking to engage to tell. And not to mention prisoners of war, which Boston and the surrounding region hosted a fair-sized community of during the American Revolution, and the role of foreign nationals in helping push forward these ideals of freedom and liberty that were being espoused by the people of Boston first. And, I love our brothers and sisters in Philadelphia and beyond. But really what I'm here to say is that this is the history of the people of Boston. And if we do not tell the story, if we do not embrace it and look to shape it in the way we want it to be told, other communities will do that for us and are already doing it in Philadelphia and Yorktown and Alabama. These are all places that have built freedom trails or have built Concord Bridge and do reenactments of Paul Revere's Ride. And they have a Liberty Tree, which in the case of Philadelphia, they didn't have one historically, but they have a copy of Boston's now. So I'm here just to say that we are looking forward to being part of the process. We are here as a resource. We encourage you to reach out to us, engage with us. We are happy to hear your thoughts on how to make this commemoration meaningful to the people of Boston. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'd like to call up Leon Wilson. Leon has a time restraint, so I want to take Leon out of order. Leon? Okay, then we'll go to Nate. Nate, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for this opportunity to speak with you today. And thank you, Councillor Bach, for sponsoring this important hearing. My name is Nat Scheidley, and in addition to being an historian of early America, I currently serve as the president and chief executive officer of Revolutionary Spaces, which is a new cultural organization that was formed earlier this year through the merger of the Bostonian Society and the Old South Association. And I thought I might share with you a little bit about how our organization is thinking about the work of commemoration during the next 5 or 6 years. Share a little bit of a concrete example of recent work that we've done this year as part of the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, and just share a few thoughts I have about what might mark success for a semi-quincentennial commission or a Sestercentennial commission for Boston. So our organization cares for and interprets for the public 2 national treasures located on Boston's Freedom Trail: the Old State House, which served as the seat of government in colonial Massachusetts, and Old South Meeting House, which was both a congregational meeting house and a key gathering place for popular politics during the Revolutionary era. I really think that the stories that live in our sites, and more broadly, the stories from the founding era and subsequent eras of struggle that can be found at sites scattered across all of Boston's neighborhoods, should be seen as a precious resource for our city, not just because of what they can tell us about our nation's past, and not just because they are magnets that draw tourists from all over the world to Boston, although certainly they do those things. They're a precious resource for us because they're tools that can help us to address the challenges that our democracy and our city face today, right? So the pivotal events that took place in Boston and elsewhere during the 1760s and the 1770s, and that led ultimately to American independence, also gave shape to a profound and enduring set of questions that we're still grappling with today. right? Who speaks for me? How does my voice get to be heard? What's my recourse if I am silenced or if I'm ignored? And above all, when we say we the people, what exactly do we mean by that? Who gets to be inside that circle of we, whose voice counts, right? So every generation of Americans has argued over the answers to those questions. Our answers tell us who we are, right? And that argument has stretched from the revolutionary generation right down to the present. I think it's fair to say, in fact, that that argument represents the deepest and truest current running through all of American thought and life across almost 250 years now, right? And importantly, throughout this long conversation, the public memory of the revolution has itself been a source of inspiration, and again has been a vehicle for binding Americans of all backgrounds together around a common sense of purpose. So just one brief example to illustrate this last point, and it ties to our commemoration of the Boston Massacre this year. In 1858, at the peak of our nation's argument over the institution of slavery, Boston's Black anti-slavery leaders organized a protest meeting that took place at Faneuil Hall on March 5th, the anniversary of the Boston Massacre. And the purpose of that meeting was to honor the figure of Crispus Attucks, the mixed African-American, Native American sailor and son of Framingham, who had been one of 5 civilians who was killed at the Boston Massacre in 1770, so 88 years earlier. So why did abolitionists choose to lift up Attucks in that way? They were responding very specifically to slaveholders and their allies who argued that the institution of slavery could not be abolished because those in bondage were not capable of becoming free citizens. African descended people, slaveholders argued, were not able to sacrifice on behalf of the common good, which was seen as the essential ingredient of citizenship. To which Black anti-slavery leaders in Boston responded, well, maybe you haven't met our friend Crispus Attucks, right? Because he was arguably the first American to give up his life in defense of American liberty. Today, we are still working and fighting to perfect our multiracial and multicultural democracy. We are still grappling with those questions. Whose voice matters? Who speaks for me? What does we the people mean? And it's precisely because of the urgency of those questions that the city of Boston should invest in commemorating the 250th anniversary of the revolution, including the anniversary of independence in 2026, but not limited to that anniversary. I think with strong leadership, with participation by residents from across the city, and the investment of real resources, Boston's 250th commemoration would not distract our city from the profoundly important conversations that we are having about equity and racial justice at the present moment. Instead, that commemoration could be an inclusive platform for precisely those conversations that we so desperately need to have. So what would a commemoration like that look like? That, of course, is, I think, for the Sestercentennial commissioners to decide if we do have such a commission. But Councillor Bach did ask me to share just a little bit of our recent work at Revolutionary Spaces as an example of what may be possible. So as I said, this year is the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, which is an event that figures prominently in the history of both of the sites that we care for. And so we have obviously devoted much of our programming this year to the story of the Boston Massacre. And what we have chosen to do is to commemorate that important step on the road to revolution through an arc of programming that explores the complex interplay of race, citizenship, and memory by using the figure of Crispus Attucks as its primary lens. So unfortunately, we had to postpone a probing public art installation commissioned from African-American artist Lauren Woods. We had to postpone a new play about Attucks written by a local playwright named Miranda Adekoje. But we did open an exhibition at the Old State House in March. We surrounded it with a year-long series of panel discussions and community conversations. And both the exhibition and the programs use the figure of Attucks as a lens to get at not just the history of the massacre. We look at the historical figure, but we also look at how later abolitionists and civil rights leaders in Boston, right down to Melnia Cass during the 1960s and the 1970s, used the memory of Attucks to advance the cause of racial justice. So the programming is going to culminate next year with a participatory program that takes its inspiration from Boston's long tradition of honoring the massacre victims with an oration, but we'll invite members of our community, our many neighborhoods here in Boston, to offer their own heartfelt remembrance of someone that they have lost who inspires them to work for a better future, right? So it is my hope that the city will act quickly to create a Sestercentennial Commission that will build on the start that we've made through some of this work and through the fantastic work that Revolution 250 and many other organizations throughout the city have already begun. And I think the commission should be charged with considering how the commemoration of our city's revolutionary past might, between now and 2026, serve as a platform to engage all people, people from all backgrounds, in dialogue about what justice looks like. And that it should empower them to have their voices heard and give new life to our still unfinished struggle to create and sustain a free society. Specifically, I think it should recognize that its success depends in particular on three factors, which have come up in the prior discussion and in my comments here today. Number one, I think a successful commemoration has to use a cross-temporal frame, to use Councillor Bach's words earlier, that connects Boston's revolutionary history with both the subsequent struggles for liberty and equality that it inspired and the challenges that we are grappling today, right? That's how we turn public history into a resource to build the future for our city, right? Is to make that linkage between the past and the present. Second, a successful commemoration has to engage people of all backgrounds and in every neighborhood, connecting us through our shared connection to Boston's remarkable history. And finally, and this is important, a successful commemoration is only going to happen if it's accompanied by real investment in our infrastructure for sharing Boston's history with both local audiences and those who visit from all over the world, leaving the Freedom Trail, organizations like mine, and community archives across the city stronger and better equipped to do our work for the next 50 or more years. I think we can look back at the bicentennial and say that it left a legacy of investment in our historic infrastructure. And I hope that the 250th commemoration will do the same thing for Boston, leave it stronger than it was before. But I think it's important for us to recognize that where we are today, what our historic infrastructure looks like, has been deeply compromised by the pandemic. So we have all fallen behind due to the financial impact of this past year, where we were at the start of the year. So we need investment to get back to where we were, and then we need investment in order to shape a really transformational commemoration that can move our city forward. So those are my thoughts. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you, and I hope to remain engaged in the conversation moving forward.
Thank you, Nate. Leon, you're up next. Sorry, yeah. we tried to jump you up, but it didn't work out. So you're on.
That's okay. You know, this is just one of those days when schedules don't work well. But I appreciate this opportunity to come before you and the invitation to support this initiative. You know, my staff, after some conversation, has informed me that some of them were part of a Rev 250 commission some time ago. So we probably have at the museum something in the wings that we ought to resurrect. And I think, it's certainly we would continue to support this effort. I think also, to echo Nat's words, you know, sustainability and the pandemic and all the issues that normally speak to your ability to kind of involve yourself aggressively in opportunities like this are before us. You know, we think A, should be done. B, of course, we're going to support it. And anything that we can do, we'll do. We also want to make sure that there's adequate capital or at least attention to what's required to move it forward. The museum, and I assume that many of you have already been there at 46 Joy Street, and just a quick switch around the corner from Joy to Smith Court, is where we have our buildings. And one is the meeting house itself, and the other is the Abel Smith School. The Abel Smith School is the building where we have our exhibitions. We've got a recently renovated first floor, and then we've got 2 floors of our own collection. One is our collection on jazz in the Boston area, and the other is a collection of those 3,000 items, some of those 3,000 items that are part of our permanent collection. We've got more, we're changing it on a regular basis. We actually remained open a bit longer and a bit more actively than some of those on the trail. We closed in early March, March 13th to be exact, and we opened in July. And along the way, we were available virtually. So we bring the assets and experience of the 18th and 19th century. What we are and what we have been historically is a platform for discourse and dialogue as related to issues of equity, as related to issues of freedom, and clearly going back to those brave abolitionists who represented those concerns about those who were recently out of enslavement and those that would target slave patrols on Beacon Hill. We believe that we're still a place for that dialogue that takes place. It doesn't mean that we agree with all that might be said from our platform. It doesn't mean that we want everyone to agree with our position. We don't stake a position that's any different than what you will get by looking at what we've got for documentation, what we've got for a collection, and what we've got, again, for 18th and 19th century history. We consider ourselves to be authenticators and the custodians of those pieces of American history that might not actually be out there in the open. We all know that there are just some elements of revision that will take place in our history books that might not have taken place if, in fact, we didn't have those issues that started with enslavement and continue, even to the present day. So again, we're a platform. We look for opportunity to allow others to come and stake a position, talk openly, disagree with us, but more importantly, have dialogue. We're in the African Meeting House, the oldest freestanding Black church in America. Our buildings themselves are part of what we consider our collection and our asset base. When you go into that building, you are in history. You're in very buildings that Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and many other names that I won't even toss out in the interest of time, but they were the names that were impactful in setting the stage for where we are today in America, and they were impactful in setting the stage for what I'll call truthful American history. We have no issue about arguing with the matter that not everything that ought to be in the history books are in the history books. We have no issue with the opportunity that we would love to see new books. We have programs that speak to that. We take very aggressive positions. On the other hand, we're interested in nothing more than the truth. And as a museum, that is our role as an organization. That is, what our strong and dedicated staff put out in the public, airwaves. The programs that we're putting together are those for the public school systems. There are also programs for businesses, and there are programs, and one we've got, which we call a lunch forum, is where we will go into a company and elaborate on what we consider those missing aspects of American history. We invite dialogue in those organizations, and it's good because whatever a company espouses, to the extent that they support it aggressively, and when we come in and validate that, I think it makes for a strong partnership, and it also speaks to opportunity. I'm not sure what we would do in terms of particular programs to support this initiative that you've put in front of us. However, we'll do and we'll dialogue, and I suspect that I'll go back to the staff. I've only been in this role since January. So I admit to a strong and lofty learning curve in terms of both what we might do, although a lot of that will come through my leadership, but more importantly, what we have done in terms of this opportunity for Rev 250. So I'm not sure what more I can tell you at this point. I'm not going to try and describe what we do in the museum. I think it speaks for itself. Those are the assets. The buildings are part of that. We're on Beacon Hill. From that location, it spawned some of the most impactful African-American churches in Boston today, People's Baptist Church, 12th Baptist Church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, all of which are involved in forging where we are, particularly as it relates to issues of equity that we're dealing with today from the pulpit. And I know that because I remember one of those churches, does come stories today still of what might we do so that, some of the things that we find on major TV networks today might be presented from a different perspective, might be presented from a historical perspective of this is what got us to the point where we are today. These were the issues. Had they been presented differently, had they been responded to differently, might have, for instance, just the mere fact that at some point slave patrols were moving around Beacon Hill. And these are actually free people who in some cases were in a circumstance where they might have been captured, forced either into slavery, or in some cases they'd escaped to freedom, might be forced back into slavery. Those are emblematic of some of the very kinds of things that we represent and believe are happening today in terms of law enforcement. And I don't want to dwell on the negative side of that, but we do think that some of those things go deep and they're handed down from generation to generation. And so certain codes of behavior, although certainly not validated or certainly not legalized, there is an understanding that these are some of the things we might do. And I think it leads to some of the discrepancies in terms of law enforcement and equal treatment. So again, I apologize for arriving late. It's just been one of those hour after hour after hour. There's a Zoom call, it seems. But I'll be pleased to answer any questions, and that might be a better opportunity for me to kind of tell you what we would do. But we absolutely, I can tell you from an organizational perspective, support this initiative, and we'll do everything possible to help it go forward. And we should embrace it as a city.
Great. Thank you so much, Leon. I'm taking over chairing from Councillor Baker. I'm really grateful to you for being here and stewarding really one of our gems in the city. And I think one of my hopes for this Sestercentennial is that on the other end of it, a lot more people will know about the incredible work and legacy that the museum stewards. So thank you. And I want to go to the last person on this panel, Jean-Luc Pirait, who's from the North American Indian Center of Boston, because as Councillor Mejia highlighted, we really want to make sure that we are starting, when we talk about commemoration and we talk about historical memory in the city, that we are starting with our Native and Indigenous peoples and their stories. So Jean-Luc, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Councillor Bach. My name is Jean-Luc Pirait. I'm a member of the Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana, a resident of Jamaica Plain, and I serve as president of the board of directors at the North American Indian Center of Boston, or NACOB, which is at 105 South Huntington Avenue in JP. And it's Massachusetts' oldest urban Indian center, which we observed our 50th year of service to the New England Native American community on October 20th of this year. In recognizing the shared history between City of Boston and Indigenous nations with ancestral and cultural ties to the land, we must engage in as comprehensive of a tribal consultation process as possible and be considerate of at least 3 resident populations. First, to enumerate the universe of tribal nations concerned, NACOB cites Mayor Menino's 1996 proclamation commemorating internment of American Indians on Boston Harbor Islands during the King Philip's War. Included in that proclamation are the Massachusetts, Abenaki, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, Penobscot, Unkachog, Montaukett, Paugussett, Mohegan, Pequot, Unkachog, Shinnecock, Brothertown, and Chattahoochee tribes or First Nations. Since 1976, through an executive order by Governor Dukakis, NACOB, formerly Boston Indian Council, is designated as a liaison between the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and residents who are members of the tribes with historical government-to-government relationships, including those aforementioned and the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy. Most of the community members or the members of these nations were impacted by the Boston Indian Imprisonment Act, which remained enacted from the King Philip's War until 2005. Secondly, and in being inclusive as possible, we must include the lived experiences of contemporary Indigenous women recognized as community members of NACOB, including exemplars such as Winona Leduc, Louise Erdrich, and Anime Akwash. Third, we must further consider the lived experiences of immigrant community members who represent Indigenous nations of the Caribbean, Central and South America, and other American territories. Furthermore, we must acknowledge the intersectionality of Black and Indigenous history as represented by ancestors such as Crispus Attucks, or those impacted by the local slave trade at landmarks such as Faneuil Hall. With the support of the city, NACOB would liaise with the wide range of governments and tribal historic preservation officers, as well as those present and former community members, in addition to facilitating community-based public educational programming. And finally, NACOB hopes that in recognizing local Indigenous history in the city of Boston, that this will reinvigorate relationships to ensure the quality of life and economic development for our Indigenous community members, and to promote further engagement between our community members and tribes that have had cultural and ancestral ties with this area for a sustainable future into the next 250 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean-Luc. And I really appreciate you bringing that whole architecture of Native and Indigenous history keeping into this space, because I think it needs to be central and part of the folks planning, and not sort of not an afterthought and not the end of this process right at the beginning. So really glad to have you with us and bringing that perspective. We are going to jump quickly to the other panel so that we have a chance for as with the administration, we sort of have both a conversation about the commemoration itself going on and about these historical tools and how we use this opportunity to do historic preservation at a more robust and more community level. And so we're going to jump to that panel, and then we'll do questions for all. And I want to also thank the folks who are here to give public comment. I know we're keeping you waiting, but this has been a very rich conversation already, and I'm really grateful for all the participants. So I'm going to go first to Greg Gaylor from the Boston Preservation Alliance. Greg?
Thank you, Counselor. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. Yes, I'm Greg Gaylor, the Executive Director of the Boston Preservation Alliance, and I'd like to thank you for calling the hearing, and I'd also like to recognize Counselor Edwards, who began discussions of a hearing of the topic of historic preservation over a year ago. For over 30 years, I've been a public historian and a preservation professional, and I've seen the power of the connection with historic places, what it can bring, the emotional, social, and economic well-being historic places provide. And I too, like others here today, am a product of the bicentennial. And today we have an opportunity to energize a new generation to tell and preserve a more inclusive story about Boston. For over 40 years, the Boston Preservation Alliance has been an independent voice pushing the city to think carefully about the irreplaceable historic places that make Boston unique, desirable, and successful. These are the places that define our neighborhoods and our communities. It's the stories of people and events connected to those places that allow Bostonians to not only see themselves in our collective history, but it empowers them to be engaged members of society, and it encourages them to see themselves as stewards of a legacy to which they also contribute. Now, today I'm focusing on the preservation process, and I'll be candid, I'm going to be a little more blunt than some of the others you've heard from this afternoon on the city panel. The Alliance and our network have been increasingly frustrated by a mentality and a regulatory framework that has stopped growing and evolving, that hasn't been truly supported at City Hall for a long time. The world of historic preservation has evolved and matured, but Boston hasn't kept up. The city in many ways has prioritized growth and too often sees preservation as an impediment rather than an opportunity. You've heard about some of the challenges through Chairman of the Landmarks Commission Smilage, and we've really shunted aside the city agency responsible for preservation. Really is an ugly stepchild unable to bring to all Bostonians the many benefits we should be reaping from one of the things that we claim to hold with great pride, our city's history. Boston was once considered among the best in the country for how we treated our historic resources. much of that growing from the great work that happened at the Bicentennial. But sadly, that's no longer the case. We've grown stagnant, relying on dated policies that no longer protect what Bostonians deem historic in their own neighborhoods. We miss opportunities, and often by the nature of historic preservation not taken advantage of, we miss opportunities and lose them forever. For example, the Alliance for years has recommended updates to the Article 85 demolition delay bylaw, which you've already heard a fair amount about today. But despite what you've heard, we found senior staff at City Hall have stymied our efforts to make changes. Now, I'm sure as councilors, you've received distraught calls from residents who feel unable to protect their history, and probably from the development community who are frustrated by it too. That's because this rule needs to be updated and needs changes today. And I'm glad there's been some public recognition in this hearing that this needs to happen, because we haven't found that the case in reality. Now, we have a large list of changes to Article 85 demolition delay that we've shared with a variety of city officials in recent years, and I'll just mention a few of them. Extending the delay was one thing that was mentioned, but what really needs to happen is a process needs to be developed that happens during that delay. Just extending the delay itself doesn't really solve the problem, although a longer delay does incentivize people to have a conversation and look at opportunities for other solutions beyond demolition. Demolition needs to be considered not just for its historic issue, but also its environmental one, which is also an important issue for the city. Another example is that if a delay is passed, the site passes the 90-day delay, or if we extend that delay, that approval needs to sunset at some period of time. Currently, it does not. So a delay that has gone on and passed can pass for multiple owners in different projects, even though one was considered when the delay was initially submitted. Similarly, our landmarking process, which you've heard a bit about, the strongest tool the city has to protect historic places. It's drowned by a backlog that has an understaffed agency that can't manage it. Sites like the William Lloyd Garrison House in Roxbury, the Ashmont Hill neighborhood sit in limbo, not fully protected, and they have for decades. It's embarrassing that we created no protected historic districts since 2008, when the Fort Point Channel District was created, while other cities have created new districts time and time again. And when a neighborhood like Highland Park in Roxbury organizes and demands to be designated a district, they have to wait seemingly indefinitely because the city fails to sufficiently fund the staffing necessary to support the citizens of this minority community. And while you heard that this is making progress and we're excited about that and has been making steps, the community is still waiting for this process to begin in earnest. And meanwhile, the city fails to leverage this opportunity to support other neighborhoods who also want a designated historic district. Now, I want to make sure councilors realize, because as Chairman Smilage of the Landmarks Commission has mentioned, people think the Landmarks Commission has far more authority than it does. Do you realize that the North End, Charlestown, Chinatown, Dorchester, East Boston, Fenway, Hyde Park, JP, Mattapan, Rosendale, Roxbury, West Roxbury, the list goes on, have no real ability to protect their historic neighborhoods because they have no local Boston landmark districts. Our current system is not supporting the vast majority of the neighborhoods who care about their history. And do you know that the city has no willingness to act against owners who demolish their properties through neglect? A great example is the Ali Albana Brewery in Mission Hill, which has been deteriorating and vacant for years, despite the fact that there have been a number of willing buyers that we've pushed to the owner, buyers that are considering turning this historic resource into affordable housing. And the city has no willingness, no desire to seemingly act and present those sorts of demolitions. As mentioned, the landmarking process has not been significantly updated since its creation in 1975. And places of local significance can't be designated as local landmarks. I mean, how crazy is that? So we strongly support and are thankful for the discussion that happened earlier this afternoon about changing the legislation to allow sites of local and diverse history to be protected as landmarks. History can be a tool attracting tourists and locals to the neighborhoods to realize the history they think they know also happened far beyond downtown. They could see the Shirley Eustace or the Malcolm X or the William Lloyd Garrison houses in Roxbury. Learn that transcendentalism is rooted in Brook Farm in West Roxbury. The trade upon which the nation was built depended on an East Boston shipyard, but we typically don't support those opportunities, and I'm hoping this anniversary gives us a chance to do so. We too often give lip service to the fact that we are arguably the nation's most historic city, but we've failed to invest in our Landmarks Commission, which has been underfunded, understaffed, and unable to keep the ball in the air. Never mind move it forward to meet the changing nature of historic preservation nationally. That's why there's a backlog of over 80 landmark petitions. That's why neighborhoods get ignored when they ask for a new historic district. That's why proactive work to tell a more complete story doesn't happen. That's why our preservation landscape is inequitable. While the preservation community recognizes it has much work to do to tell a more full story of America, Boston hasn't even kept up with where we should have been before the murder of George Floyd, never mind where we are now. Preservation, the Landmarks Commission is isolated rather than integrated into a mindset at City Hall. It's an attitude and an outlook that should permeate the various aspects that determine Boston's evolution. Now, let me be clear. This isn't about stopping development, freezing the city in time, or NIMBYism. It's about enhancing our ability to keep Boston at the forefront of supporting the sweet spot between growth and preserving the things that make the city a livable, unique, equitable, and resident-friendly place. It's about fostering the power of our past to support present and future, as others have mentioned today. It's about spreading the benefits of history-based cultural tourism beyond downtown to the neighborhoods who suffer from the lack of foot traffic critical to success. Just one example, imagine how differently residents of Mattapan would feel if the square was a bustling Main Street district because tourists were engaged to ride our historic trolley line, passing historic and natural landscapes en route. Now is the time to make the necessary changes to our broken system. Doing so will bring back to the city benefits far more than it will cost. So specifically, I urge the council to use this anniversary to inventory, assess existing, and make recommendations for enhanced or new preservation regulations. That the city hire an independent specialist expert in the diversity of preservation methods and benefits to make this assessment. And that the city invest in a comprehensive inventory of historic resources so we can be proactive for residents and the real estate community with the predictability all deserve. I look forward to further discussions with the council on ways to support this once-in-a-generation opportunity to both celebrate and honor and use it as a tool to enhance the lives and pride of residents throughout the city for their history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg. Next up is Kathy Kotoridis, who's the Executive Director of Historic Boston. And then we've got Leslie Reed from Madison Park, and then Brianna Kurosecki from Place Economics. So going first to Kathy.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Bach, and really appreciate your interest in these matters and your leadership in advancing policy discussion around them. I'm Kathy Kotoridis. I'm Executive Director of Historic Boston, Inc., a private nonprofit organization that works exclusively within the municipality of Boston to save historic buildings that are endangered or at risk, and to put them back into use for new purposes that serve the needs of contemporary Bostonians. We were founded 60 years ago to save the old corner bookstore at the corner of School and Washington Streets in downtown Boston. That building dates to 1718, was in pretty rough shape and had been scheduled for demolition for an urban renewal finance parking garage. But instead, our founders bought it with their own money. They restored it to its 19th century appearance, and in the end, made it what it always was, which is a commercial tax-paying structure, which it continues to be today, while also being an official historic site on Boston's Freedom Trail. On the heels of the 1976 bicentennial, a very important period of time, apparently, Historic Boston took the model of the old corner bookstore into the neighborhoods of the city and has since restored and rehabilitated dozens of historic buildings throughout the city's neighborhoods by purchasing them, redeveloping them, and then selling them to interested parties willing to protect and preserve them going forward. Places like the 1786 Fowler Clark Epstein Farm in Mattapan, recently rehabilitated A historic farm recently rehabilitated into a demonstration farm and headquarters for the Urban Farming Institute. The 1834 Alva Kittredge House in Roxbury, which is now 5 apartments, and 2 of which are permanently affordable after sitting vacant for the better part of 30 years. The 1859 Eustis Street Firehouse in Nubian Square, which is the city's oldest remaining firehouse, empty for the better part of 50 years, that HBI put back into use as 2 nonprofit office suites. The 1912 Roslindale Substation, right in Roslindale Village, which today is a beer garden for Turtle Swamp Brewing and co-working space. And the 1868 Vertulo Building in Hyde Park, which a few years ago was converted into 4 apartments and 5 small retail businesses, restoring the building to its 1860s appearance when Hyde Park was founded. We're small, but the demand for our work in all kinds of building conditions, historic churches, derelict buildings in tax title or under a bad owner, or buildings scheduled for demolition by upstart developers who are proposing to replace historic buildings, these often exceed our capacity to keep up. We endorse the establishment of a commission to look at preservation and plans for a forthcoming celebration in Boston, but the idea should be that the two work together, the idea of celebrating, but also evaluating our preservation tactics and tools so that we're ready for the immediate future, but we're also prepared for many years to come. Today, the issues around historic preservation in our city are really different than what they were in the bicentennial era of 76. And let's not also forget that very shortly after we celebrate the 250th in Boston, we'll be celebrating Boston's 400th birthday. So they are really quite seamless celebrations. A lot of new history has been created since that period of time, and the circumstances certainly of our city have changed. In 76, we were a city grappling with disinvestment, civil rights issues, and growing crime data that was really burdening our neighborhoods. At that point, we were anxious to recruit new businesses, increase population, arrest the decline of older buildings. And today, though, we're constantly fighting the other converse problem, which is that we're fighting demolitions that come from efforts to build up our neighborhoods and create more density, but not with much attention to the information about the historic places, largely because much of our recent history is not well known. In 76, there were many places in Boston's neighborhoods where visitors could have experienced real sites of the American Revolution, but tourism in 76 into our neighborhoods was not strong. And even today, I would argue we lack physical and promotional infrastructure to get people there, visitors, and to bring economic development through preservation and heritage tourism to our neighborhoods. Foot traffic in our business districts and to our cultural institutions in the neighborhoods, like the National Center for African American Artists, like Dorchester Heights in South Boston and the Standpipe in Highland Park. These would make excellent places for visitation, but they would also build vibrancy in our neighborhoods and help to promote that. But simply, they're not on the map. And when I say that, I mean that quite literally. They're not on the Boston and Massachusetts tourism maps. And those maps are old and need to change. In 76, we were also emerging from the urban renewal era and its after effects. And we did so with new preservation tools that have been discussed. But only a few things, really, like demolition delay and the availability of state and federal historic tax credits have emerged as incentives to promote preservation in more recent years. The times have changed and all of our tools and mechanisms for preservation and planning need to be assessed comprehensively and adjustments made. And we strongly endorse that whatever commission may be established, that there be a committee that looks at how Boston does preservation, an audit of our tools and practices so we can tweak and keep doing it better. At the same time, let's just be frank, the Boston Landmarks Commission needs more support and money. They have been breaking their backs for years in trying to hold on tight and really keep up with the demands of a very vibrant economy in development. I don't think we're giving them the comparable resources to be successful. The status quo really in Boston favors the well-established and well-connected in the stories we tell, and certainly the practices of protecting places. All the local landmark districts are really big tourism areas, perhaps with the exception of the South End, and hence an inordinate amount of money and time through the Landmarks Commission is devoted to Back Bay, Beacon Hill, Bay Village, South End. The rest of the city, as Greg said, really, which have wonderful and important places, are mostly unprotected. And even when the neighborhoods are interested in protecting them, it's hard for communities to get the time and attention out of certainly the Landmarks Commission, but also to find more recent information that would help to understand these places as having significance. And also, if you look at our population in general, Boston obviously is now at almost 700,000 people. And so that's a big change from where we were 50 years ago. Higher demands on space in the form of homes and businesses, and that's obvious, has obvious impacts in our development review processes. But our people have changed. We have so many new ethnic groups in Boston and many new residents, domestic and immigrant, whose recent history we don't know, and who themselves are just learning their own neighborhood's history and their place within it. We are being called upon to preserve and tell the histories of many underrepresented populations today and back through time. We've talked about Melnia Cass and Malcolm Little, but what about the activism around the Inner Belt Highway in the 60s and 70s, the protests in the 70s that led to Via Victoria in the South End, and the busing era in Boston? What are the places we will protect now, and how so, in order to make sure that we don't forget these important contributions to who we are as today and going forward? And one of the most important planning tools for the future and legacy gifts the city of Boston could give its people is a new inventory and a new understanding of the historic neighborhoods. This would be an inventory of historic buildings that would help to certainly help to engage our population in what is important and what is important to the celebration of all of Boston. But I think it would also tell us something more about the neighborhood's development activity too, and help us be better at making decisions going forward in the context of planning and development. And I imagine that you all as counselors run into the discord in neighborhoods when there's conflict over whether something should be demolished or modified significantly or not. Having more information at our disposal that is more recent and more current would help us make better decisions and help not just you all from a community standpoint, nor our neighborhoods, but also the planning and development agencies within City Hall. My colleagues will tell you about long sought after tools for preservation, whether it's demo delay or using demolition by neglect as a way to bring property owners who are sitting on derelict properties to the table. Strategies perhaps for the CPA program and funds for historic preservation that could be used differently and maybe more strategically, especially through the celebratory era, but also how we incorporate planning into all the planning initiatives of the BPDA so that it becomes almost a baseline for understanding a neighborhood's current status and evolution, but also its potential for growth. No one should ever think that historic preservation is meant to stop everything from occurring. We want good and prudent development, and certainly having good information will make that more possible. I can say from the point of view of a nonprofit developer, it would also be really helpful if those of us who are competing for historic, for landscapes or land or buildings that are historic in city permitting processes, as well as RFPs, could get a certain bonus for having been involved in or trying to rehabilitate something rather than trying to either change it or create more density. But all in all, the era of USA 250 to Boston 400 demands a new and more progressive look at how Boston as a modern city looks after its historic resources. We should be at the cutting edge when it comes to preservation of historic places and the management of what should be a constantly growing and changing city. We should also be forward thinking about the changes that will inevitably come to our people and our land. So we make sure that we don't end up liking history only when it's warm and fuzzy, nor when we have a significant celebration. If we're proud of our history and historic architecture and neighborhoods, then it should be central to the means by which we shape the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And thank you for those really rich comments. I will just remind our last two panelists just to try to keep to the 3 to 5 minutes, just so that we have a chance. I want to get to our public testimony folks too. But thank you for all of that. And I should also acknowledge that a while back we were joined by my colleague, Council President Kim Janey. So welcome, President Janey. And I want to jump now to Leslie Reed from Madison Park Development Corporation. Leslie.
Hello. I want to thank the council for scheduling this important hearing. My name is Leslie Reed, and I'm the CEO of Madison Park Development Corporation. We're a community-based nonprofit, and we'll be celebrating our 55th anniversary next year. Our anniversary of working to support resident-led community development in and around Roxbury. As we approach the 250th anniversary of 1776, we have a really important opportunity to celebrate so much more than just the revolution and founding of our country. This provides us the opportunity to revisit and improve how we identify and the tools we use to recognize and preserve the historic resources in our city. I'll be perfectly honest with you all. For many years, I considered myself a closet preservationist. Why? Because all too often, historic preservation is viewed as exclusionary, associated with NIMBYism, and interested primarily in celebrating the dominant culture. Well, I'm coming out of the closet because I've had the privilege to experience how community residents, affordable housing developers, and other nonprofits have shown that historic preservation can be about equity, both in diversifying and celebrating a broader range of historic and cultural resources, by providing affordable housing and equitable development opportunities, and contributing to climate resiliency and sustainability by saving and reusing existing buildings. I'd like to share with you a couple of examples. Hibernian Hall is a historic building built in 1913 for the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and was a gathering place for local Irish residents all the way through to the 1960s, after which it was taken over by a nonprofit focused on job training for local African Americans, and it closed in 1989. In 2005, Madison Park obtained the abandoned building and completed a historic renovation. And today, I hope that many of you have visited the restored Grand Ballroom, which now serves as a cultural and civic venue that celebrates specifically the African-American community and also more recent immigrants to our city. I'd also like to, share the example of the Dillaway School on Kenilworth Street. It's a school building that was built in 1882 and one of only 2 buildings remaining of 25 examples of architecture in the time. That building was renovated through a historic reuse and is now home to 20 low-income families in the heart of Nubian Square. These are examples that show how historic preservation and restoration have resulted in cultural, economic, and equitable benefits to our neighborhood. That said, we're finding that many of our historic resources are being lost, either because there isn't an avenue to their recognition and also to speculation in a heated real estate market. And we really need to find ways to expand identification of these resources, especially the less prominent ones in our community, and ways to save them and encourage a broader range of partners in that effort. So I've heard people mention buildings that honor Malcolm X, Melnia Cass, and Henry Hampton as examples of the opportunities that we'd like to capture in Roxbury. And I'd like to share with you a few ways that we could take advantage of better using preservation tools to achieve that. So improving the use of local significance to expand how we identify historic resources in our communities, especially our neighborhoods, is really important. Demo delay is not an effective tool to engage property owners and developers in real opportunities to preserve and restore local historic resources and can be improved. We should conduct an inventory and improve the incentives that recognize and support the diverse historic resources and narratives, especially in our neighborhoods. We need to increase the resources the city invests, especially into organizations like the Boston Landmark Commission, so that all residents and neighborhoods have access to historic resources and get the important attention they need. We should also better leverage historic districts and resources to expand economic development and tourism into our neighborhoods. So again, this is a unique moment when we can really enhance our understanding of historic resources and invest more deeply in policies and funding to ensure that all of our residents and neighborhoods have a more equitable opportunity at self-determination when it comes to the history of our city and nation as a whole. A commission committed to this mission is a critical step to have a transparent and constructive approach to improving the tools we have to support historic recognition, preservation, and restoration or reuse in our city and neighborhoods. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and for all the amazing work that Madison Park does. I just want to quickly go to our last panelist, Brianna Grosicki.
Yes, thank you. I actually have slides, so hopefully this shares quickly here. Share. Let me go to full screen.
Great. Yeah, if you can just run through them quickly just so we can get to.
Absolutely. How do I make this go full screen? Come on. Okay, my name's Brianna Grosicki. I'm Associate Principal at Place Economics. We are a Washington, D.C. based consulting firm where we work at the nexus of historic preservation and economics. So I'm coming to you all today briefly to just talk about like what we've learned about in our numerous assignments across the country. It's very hard to follow a lot of the moving statements that were already made today about your 250th celebrations, but also this. So I kind of come in on this question of like, what are some tools that could be built upon that you are going to be thinking about as you move through the next few years. I just want to point out that the great foundation of how built heritage can be protected was actually written here in Boston by MIT professor Mark Schuster, framed that heritage can be protected through direct ownership, regulations, fiddling with property rights, incentives, and information and education. So there is no one fix all, and certainly designation is not the only tool. Article 85 is not the only tool. So I just offer these as kind of a foundation here. In our firm, we often speak about tools, strategies, and incentives and use that language because municipalities benefit from preservation ethos that is spread horizontally across different departments and initiatives. So that preservation, the charge for preservation is not siloed in one department. So cities use a tool like a deconstruction ordinance that pairs with the strategy of educating people on why historic preservation helps you meet your sustainability and carbon impact goals. And this can be coupled with incentives to change consumers' behavior, make rehabilitation the easy choice, as Kathy was talking about. Overall, the benefits of preservation and keeping older buildings around are numerous. In our economic work, we continually find that preservation is a job creator. In fact, nationally, on the top left here, for every 100 jobs rehabilitation creates, 186 jobs elsewhere in the economy. And that's more than new construction, which has more of its money going towards materials and less towards labor, and thus creates 135 jobs elsewhere. A recent study in Pennsylvania using their historic tax credit found that rehab creates more jobs per $1 million of expenditure than the natural gas industry, which is huge in Pennsylvania. So historic buildings are key to supporting our small businesses. The National Trust for Historic Preservation Atlas of Reurbanism on the bottom left here actually has data specific to Boston, and they found that 61% more jobs were in small businesses. These are in areas of Boston with older buildings, not necessarily landmarked areas. They also found 54% more jobs in new businesses, and that 62% of women and minority-owned businesses were in older buildings. These are key to keeping around, whether they're landmarked or not. With the 250th, it's fitting to point out that heritage tourists spend more locally than non-heritage tourists. So for Ms. Davis, I'm sure she's recognized, has seen data like this before. This is from our recent study in Nashville, where heritage visitors who indicated they came specifically to visit heritage museums and sites spent more than $100 more per day than non-heritage visitors. And that has lasting economic impact, as Kathy explained, spreading out into the various neighborhoods of Boston, not just in downtown. Lastly, I'll mention that historic places will help bolster our COVID recovery. For when we all go out and can gather again, we're not going to be gathering in front of the Gap or some luxury apartment building. We're going to be gathering on Boston Common and Copley Square and in front of our historic third places. I share this graph of the median housing cost per age of housing unit across the US. This is reported by the American Housing Survey. I'll share this also with a proverb of our firm principal, Don from Ripkema, that you cannot build new and rent or sell cheap without a subsidy. But as this graph shows you, is that basically the older the housing unit, the lower the cost of housing. And this is not, there's data showing that this is not all housing in poor condition. Only 2% of housing in America is rated as being in poor condition. So what it shows is that people today are just flat out building housing that is more expensive. And I'm very curious to see what this graph looks like for the city of Boston. I share this not to say that developers are bad, but that meeting the affordable housing needs of Boston, which certainly is a priority of this administration, cannot be done by only building new. We have to consider rehabilitation in this, in our older housing, whether it is designated or not. So what are other cities doing? They're making public investments in historic preservation. Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Antonio are working their way to evaluate every property in the city. Los Angeles did it up to 1980. So looking well beyond into the future of like what is 50 years old, which is typically when we would evaluate a property for historic significance. These are gathering a proactive data set. That way a developer isn't caught off guard that their newest property is valued by the community. Many of these cities are doing it in a grassroots bottom-up approach. Who better to survey their neighborhood than the residents themselves? This approach is also combined with anthropological and oral histories to document the intangible cultural heritage in these neighborhoods. First, San Francisco and now San Antonio have legacy business registries that include grants to make sure that those businesses are supported and stay thriving to pass their traditions on to the next generation. They're also, one of our clients in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi did a social media campaign on what is historic preservation, because people don't know what they're tearing down as heritage because nobody ever talks about it. Cities are also sponsoring new opportunities. Places like Iowa City, Iowa, which is certainly a small community, but they're trying to tackle their affordable housing head on, where they're offering low interest loans to retrofit small apartment buildings and also homeowners homes to keep seniors in their homes and keep those, you know, fourplexes, in Boston's case, those triple deckers on the market as existing affordable housing. There are also places like Portland, Oregon are doing a deconstruction ordinance that requires deconstruction for buildings built prior to 1940. They have been so successful in Portland of creating new jobs and businesses that they expanded their program. It first started out in 1915, now 1940. So people have shifted their behavior of demolition to meet the demand of deconstruction. And they're keeping more materials out of the landfill. I'll also share that the city of Palo Alto, California recently outlawed demolition. They just said they realized that in order to meet their environmental goals and zero waste goals and carbon impact goals by 2030, deconstruction instead of demolition would allow them to do that. So it is helpful that the Landmarks Commission is in the Department of Environment, that those connections should be made, that tearing down buildings isn't going to help you get to carbon neutral environment. So that's the end of my spiel today. Sorry it was rapid fire. I will stop sharing my screen now. Happy to take any questions.
No, thank you, Brianna. That was great. And I appreciate you running through that. Like I said, we were a little over ambitious in everything that we could fit in today. And we just had so many great panelists, including yourself and everyone who went before. I want to quickly jump to my colleagues who are here. I think Julia Mejia and Kim Janey are still on for any questions / final comment, because I've got to get to public comment as well, and then we've got another council hearing that's happening at 5, so we've got to finish before then. So let me go first to them. Councilor Mejia?
No, I'll let President Janey go first. I can wait. I talk a lot.
Okay, President Janey.
Yeah, and in the interest of time, I hope that will be very brief. I know that I will. I just wanted to commend you, the maker. So thank you so much. I think this is a really important conversation, and I wanted to thank all of the panelists for very thoughtful presentations. Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you so much, President Janey. Yes, and yeah, no, this is very much the beginning of a conversation, and a lot of the people here, we aren't getting to ask as many questions as we should right now, but my goal is very much that they be central to a commission running forward. Councilor Mejia?
Sure. So I think a lot of the questions that I asked during the first part of the hearing were relevant to this panel. So I'm not sure if they were participating in the first part. So more around who are the organizations that are leaning in. I heard there were lots of them. So just curious in terms of the racial diversity of these organizations, where are they coming from? What does that makeup look like? So I'm curious about some of that information if it exists. And then I still feel like I'm unclear about the historical timeline and what type of programming and we're going to be doing around things that happened in the 70s here in the city of Boston. And, you know, like, I still feel like I need some clarity on that. I don't think anyone's really addressed the reality of history here. And I feel like I need that answered. I know you touched upon it, Councilor Bach, but I need to know, when we think about this, what are we preserving and how deep are we willing to go to preserve a history that is reflective of the realities that so many people here in the city of Boston have survived.
Great. Do any of the panelists, I think Leon Wilson had to go, but if Jean-Luc or John Lane or Nat, if any of you wanted to jump in on that in terms of the diversity of organizations involved in Rev 250, and then also, and I mean, I know it's related to some of what Jean-Luc said, sort of connecting to the present moment and more recent history with this.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in briefly. I can address both questions in part, but I'm happy to have other panelists jump in as well. So specifically on the question of diversity, I would like to suggest that we consider an important goal for the commemoration the transformation of the makeup of the organizations that currently do public history work in Boston. I think we say in our organization that a goal for this next arc of work is for our audience to look like the city of Boston and for the organization to look like the city of Boston, but that's not where we're starting. So I think to do the work well during this next period of time means not focusing just on the organizations, but focusing also on the nature of participation in developing the plans. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is, as we develop our programming plans and the core questions and themes, to have those be the outcome of dialogue with the communities of Boston that we're trying to engage, right? So that we step away from the mode of a small number of organizations saying we're going to be the authoritative voice of what history means. And instead, we consider our role to be to invite the people of Boston to join with us to participate in making meaning around our past, right? If we can engage people in that way and inspire people to see the past as a resource for the work that they're already engaged in their neighborhoods and in city politics, I think we have a greater chance for the next generation of feeling as though the sort of work of curating our city's history truly reflects the diverse makeup of our city as a whole. So that's one point. And on the other point of what is the timeline for this, I mean, I think a 250th commission needs to have as its center the sort of a touchstone around the revolutionary history. The case I was trying to make was that there's an arc of of connection between the questions that were born in the revolutionary moment and the work that has happened in our city and in our country ever since, right? So movements for social justice use the history of the revolution as part of the raw material for advocating for greater equality and justice. And I think that we should reflect that when we commemorate the 250th, that we're not just commemorating the Boston Tea Party, for example, but we're using the Boston Tea Party as a platform to engage the people of Boston in a conversation about what the role of protest is in a free society, right? And to get at that, we need to look at moments of protest across the whole sweep. The protests that, Kathy, you were mentioning around the inner belt, and so many of the protest movements that we can point to in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, right down to the moment that we're living in today, so that people see themselves as part of an unbroken current, right? We should recognize that the revolution didn't get it all figured out, right? It gave us a set of problems we always will continue to grapple with. And in that sense, this generation is a generation of revolutionaries, no less than the generation that lived in Boston in the 1760s and the 1770s.
We're still fighting the good fight, and the battle is still continues. But I want to ask Greg a quick question. And you said something earlier, and I know this was a while ago, but in regards to the fact that the city has not moved in ways that really honor the voices of the people and creating historical preservations and applications. So I'm just curious, what can we, based on your experience, and what can we as city councilors be fighting for to help? I know Councilor Bach is the champion of all of this, but I also would like to know what else we could be doing, at the very least, to activate our communities and the people that who live in Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, who aren't here today, who aren't paying attention to what we're talking about, who don't understand the historical, none of this. Like, what can we do better to ensure that our people are participating actively in these conversations, especially understanding the historical preservation situation better? I know that's a lot, but.
And no, that's a fair question. And thank you for asking. I think part of it is, I hate to be as crude as to say the Landmarks Commission needs more support and more funding, but that's part of it. Because the agency that's key and responsible for doing preservation work is so behind and so, they can't be proactive. They're completely reactive and snowed under, reacting to the proposals that happen downtown and even out in the neighborhoods, that they can't get out to the local neighborhoods and explain what the process is. Explain that if they want a local district, like you heard about in an area in Roxbury, here's how it works, and we'll facilitate and help you do it. The other part of the problem is we've been hearing for years from the Landmarks Commission, from the various administrations, we can't have any more local districts because a local district, a local landmark historic district, that highest level of protection that we talked about, requires a staff member to manage it. And we don't have the budget for more staff members. So that's one thing, is encouraging the administration or working through the budget that the Landmarks Commission needs support. They need more staff. They can't be so reactive. The other thing is several of us recommended that the city do a study about the tools we have, what's working and what's not working. Because the other part of the problem we have, as we've evolved to understand what's historic, as we're trying to recognize Black history sites, LGBTQ sites, women's history sites, many of those don't really fit the standard in the box that we consider historic. They may not be architectural treasures. Some historic famous architect probably didn't work on them. That doesn't make them any less significant. But the old rules we have written tend to focus on that sort of history. And we need more tools. So there has to be something between a landmark, which is hard to get, and we should loosen up how you get landmarking, but not everything should necessarily be a landmark. We have landmarking and we have a demolition delay that you heard doesn't work. There are other tools in between that we really need to be looking at. And so I think a combination of supporting a Landmarks Commission that can be more proactive, that can weigh in and educate the other neighborhoods about what the tools are, how they can fight for their history, that then when they go out to those neighborhoods, they can actually have something they can give them. Because currently people in, pick a neighborhood, the North End, Charlestown are saying, we want a local historic district, and then nothing happens because there's no support, no ability to actually implement that. So it's a combination of that and new tools and assessing the tools we have, I think are key, because there are a lot of important histories that our current tools just aren't geared to protect.
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to quickly go to Jean-Luc Pirit, who had his hand raised and answer your question, Councilor Mejia, and then we have to go to public testimony because we're going to bump up against the next hearing. So I'm just, Jean-Luc, you wanted to say something?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I did want to just kind of flesh out, especially from NACOP's standpoint, as far as like what is the time period that we're talking about. And a lot of what we're talking about from the Indigenous perspective deals with history that is 345 years, 400 years back. But at the same time, a lot of those points in history have very real impacts into what is going on within our community today, and how we navigate COVID-19 and how we navigate racial justice, especially in the context of dealing with the legacy of the Boston Indian Imprisonment Act, which again, it goes back over 300 years, but was only repealed until 2005. And under that law, it made it illegal for Native Americans to walk the streets of Boston unescorted and subject to imprisonment. So there's a very real legacy in the ways in which we sort of understand the intergenerational trauma for our community members, and at the same time, kind of using the 1776, but then also not neglecting that period of time between 1619 and 1776, which is very critical, because if we do not talk about that time period, then we are missing 150 years of enslavement and colonialism that again has very real impacts in the way our community members navigate our society today.
Great. Thank you so much, Jean-Luc, and thank you, Councilor Mejia. I want to move to public testimony, and I just would encourage everybody. I know some folks who are in public testimony have also sent written comments. If you can just keep your comments brief, just because of the number of you we have to get through in the upcoming next council hearing that's starting imminently. So the very first person I want to go to is Representative Byron Rushing, who, in addition to being a former elected official, is a real historical expert and legend, and somebody who we all really admire and look up to. So I'm just promoting him to a panelist, and after him it'll be Kelly Brilliant, and then Dan Bailey. I just want to thank the panelists so much for being here and on all fronts. And again, say this was the start of a conversation, so I'm sorry we didn't get hours to talk to each of you, but I have that very much in the plans for the future. So thank you. I want to go now to Representative Byron Rushing.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I think I have pressed all the buttons I'm supposed to press. I understand that you're getting ready to really go off in a minute. So let me start off with my last phrase that I've jotted down here, and that is, you're not doing it correctly, and you need to stop. It doesn't matter. To do this around anniversaries is to essentially do it in a white supremacist way, because the only anniversaries you're talking about are the ones that white people like. And so there is no way to get around that. Just stop it and don't do it. So I think that I want to speak. I hope Councilor Mejia is still on. And I want to speak to her, but I also appreciate Jean-Luc's comments on this. I think it's essential that if we want to involve everybody, they are the ones who we should ask, what is your most important anniversary? So we should not do this around Europeans' anniversary, right? 1776 is not a Black anniversary. There is no way that you can cut it. Anybody who does true history of 1776 probably knows that almost as many Black people fought on the British side as fought on the side of the winning patriots. And so that doesn't cut any ice. So when Black people had an opportunity to pick a date, last year they picked 1619. But that was a very unusual opportunity for them to get to pick a date. Don't do this. The issue here is true history. And what all of you need to concentrate on is how are you going to tell the history of everybody who lives in Boston right now? And how are you going to tell the history of everybody who has ever lived on this geography? And if this, and I think it's okay to stop. Don't get into this nonsense about Boston and Philadelphia. We can stop this. And finally, I think we need to apologize. The city council and the mayor, they didn't do it themselves, but the city and the city council did this. They need to apologize for all the history that was purposely erased in this city. They need to apologize for the West End. They need to apologize for every part of this city where buildings were torn down because they didn't think the people in those buildings had any value. And so if you have that in the back of your mind, then start there. Start there. We need to tell the truth. And the most important thing about this is to tell the truth. Now, if we thought that an anniversary would help us tell the truth, then I would be for the anniversary. Forget the anniversary. Get to the heart of this matter. And the heart of this matter is to tell the truth. And you, City Council, needs to struggle. It's not going to be easy. You need to struggle to form some kind of process by which we are all telling the truth, that you are mentioning the truth first and not mentioning European anniversaries and allowing the other people to get in. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you for those challenging words. And I think you're right that we've got to figure out how to make this about truth telling in our whole history. So if the orientation of it needs to change, then it needs to change. Let me go next to Kelly Brilliant from the Fenway Alliance. And then after Kelly, we've got Dan Bailey. Kelly? Kelly, are you here? I see you, but we can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry about that. Thanks, Councillor Bach, for holding this hearing, and Councillor Baker and all the speakers who came before sort of blew me away. It's been a long session. I've had an early dinner. I've gotten a few grants out, but that said, I've been listening intently, and it's really hard to follow my, somebody I super respect, Byron Rushing, and he's been a real dear to the Fenway, and his knowledge of history is immense. So he's made me kind of think, and that's great. And I think we do need to kind of investigate and evaluate how we're going to handle this. Obviously, the cultural institutions want to be a part. I represent the 21 cultural and academic in the Fenway. They are the big guns. They are the MFA. They are the Gardner. They are the BSO, NEC, Jordan Hall. They're all going through their own evaluation process, as you know, around issues of racial equity and historical representations. So I think maybe this does provide this interesting opportunity to really look at it through that critical lens. I would say through the conversations, it struck me as if we're trying to put everything in the kitchen sink in this, it will kind of be nothing. There will have to be some sort of historic focus. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to pick one, and maybe pick one, as Byron's suggesting, a really important one in our city. Maybe we lead the way in that. We are here to help, though. Anyway, the Fenway Alliance members can be part of the exhibitions, the cultural performances. We want to be part of this, and we want it to be sensitively done. And I really trust people. I know everyone here is smart and well-intentioned, and they are. I think the process will get us to a good spot, but I'm raising my hand to being part of any task force or committee that gets involved. And Byron, it was so nice to hear your voice, and the rest of the panelists were wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. All right, next up, Dan Bailey, and then it'll be Laura Alice. Dan?
Thank you. So my name's Dan Bailey. I'm an East Boston resident. This has been a really great conversation. But I hope we will use this opportunity to reform our historic preservation system and priorities in the city. So I've been working with my neighbors in East Boston for many years on historic preservation priorities in the neighborhood. And honestly, it's been really frustrating. There's a lot of support for preservation in the neighborhood, a lot of pride in the neighborhood's history, particularly the contributions of the successive waves of immigrant groups who've made homes here in East Boston and literally built the neighborhood. But demolitions of historic buildings in East Boston have only accelerated in the last 8 years since I've been living here. And to be honest, the historic preservation system in Boston is broken. I think we've done a pretty good job protecting cultural heritage and history in some of Boston's wealthiest and most powerful communities, but we're really failing our most vulnerable residents. And access to cultural heritage is a right, and it's also a matter of environmental justice. So in East Boston, for example, over generations, the neighborhood has shouldered more and more environmental and health burdens, airport expansion, construction of Route 1A, fuel storage facilities. And each of these environmental burdens was accompanied by the destruction of neighborhood cultural heritage, so loss of historic buildings, streets, and parkland, homes, and businesses without residents' consent. And that pattern continues today. So we're continually losing more and more buildings every year to private speculative development. And it's a continued slow erosion of the neighborhood's cultural heritage. And as in the past, it comes with huge environmental burdens, as we've heard from others today, the staggering amounts of waste from demolishing historic buildings and immense carbon emissions from building new buildings in their place. So really, we urgently need to reform Boston's preservation system. As we've heard, we need tools and policies that are more flexible than our current all or nothing landmark designation, and that return control of cultural heritage decisions to our communities. And we need to recognize the full value of older and historic buildings, not just as historical and cultural resources, but also as economic and environmental resources as well. And once these resources are gone, they're lost forever. So I hope we'll approach this with some urgency. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. Next up is Laura. And then after Laura, it'll be Beth Harris. Laura? Laura, we can see you, but we can't hear you.
I thought you were going to unmute me. Okay. First of all, thank you, Councillor Bach, for putting this on the agenda. This is a great hearing, and I've learned so much about what other cities are doing. And I'm very glad to hear that people are recognizing that Boston has been failing in historic preservation. I also live in East Boston in the Eagle Hill neighborhood. We are in the National Registry of Historic Places, and yet houses are getting torn down every day. Everything seems to be in the name of development, more. We are super dense. We're the third densest neighborhood in Boston, and all we keep hearing as the argument for needing to tear down family homes, single families, two families, is that we need more housing. But the housing that's being built is not the type of housing that we need, and there are other places to put it rather than in the densest place, in one of the densest places in the city. And especially because the community really is having no input, and we are trying. There are many of us who come to these hearings, we attend ZBA meetings, we submit commentary to our city councilors, to the, we come to the neighborhood meetings and we vote against projects or for projects. And at the end of the day, we're putting this time and energy, and it's extremely frustrating. This is not our job. It should be the city's job to protect these resources in our community. And I will say that, in terms of what can be done now, like I think this, 2026 plan is great. But what I think is a very important step right now, I don't know who is able to make this happen, but I've raised it before. East Boston is one of the communities that is currently undergoing rezoning. So there's something called Plan East Boston. which is supposed to, build in protections for the neighborhood character. Until that happens, though, everything is just, willy-nilly getting raised. In any given meeting I go to, there are 5 or 6 properties on the agenda that are going to be either demolished or, turned from a 2-family to a 4-family or a 6-family or a 9-family. And I think before the damage is done to the point where we are the next West End on a 1-by-1 basis, I think that there needs to be a moratorium on any demolition of properties for any of the communities that are being that are recognized for being endangered right now and that have plans for rezoning in the works. There's no point in spending all this money on doing these plans if there's going to be nothing left by the time the plans come into place. So that's what I have to say.
Great. Thank you so much. And yeah, we're just speeding through because like I said, my colleague has a hearing that I'm running into. Beth Harris and then Lydia Lowe. Beth? Beth, we can't hear you. We can see you, but you got to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry about that. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I'm with a group that's trying to save the Stanhope stables, and we're kind of in an interesting, similar position as the last speaker in that we're in a neighborhood that's in between Back Bay and South End that's been rezoned. And it was rezoned only in the last couple of years and in an interesting way, without a lot of notice to the residents that are here. And it's one of these weird situations where when they zoned it in a certain way, suddenly the historic buildings have no meaning or no purpose and they aren't protected. So I recently moved here from Los Angeles and I'm very interested in preservation. I was on the State Historic Resource Commission with the governor on a governor appointed position. And there's a lot of different tools in California, in the Los Angeles area that really do address these interesting small little spaces in otherwise unhistorical neighborhoods. And just to reiterate what people have been saying, they're only unhistorical because the history making hasn't been written yet and hasn't gotten out yet. And so this is an opportunity for in addition to looking at underserved communities, just to look at planning overall and livability. And in particular on this little street, there's a drug rehabilitation, there's a children's park, the Frida Garcia Park. There's all of these constituencies and this historic building. But because of the rezoning, it's right now all up for grabs and demolition. And there's several things planned there. They're just not really conducive to living in the neighborhood. So that's all I wanted to say. It's a time to look at this planning. I support everyone who's been saying Boston Landmarks needs more help. It's ridiculous how small the department is relative to the departments in Los Angeles and the amount of money given over to it for the amount of work that they have to do. So and I've only been here for a couple of years. I think they're amazing professionals and need a lot more support. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Rodney Singleton? Oh, sorry, it'll be Lydia Lowe and then Rodney Singleton. Lydia?
Hi, thank you. And I just want to say, I had some slides, but I'm not going to show them in the interest of time. But I think it's just important for us to really seize this opportunity, which is that, you know, the pandemic has made an unprecedented number of people become aware of the deep racial inequity that's always been there in our society. So we have to seize this opportunity to really recognize and visibilize the history of Boston's communities of color. And I think community land trusts such as mine, which are focused on collective stewardship, have an important role to play. So I've been very frustrated during Plan Downtown to see Chinatown repeatedly being named as not having no historic assets when we have a very rich history. And so we recently led a participatory planning effort to for the community's own Chinatown Master Plan 2020. And one of our important recommendations is the creation of Chinatown as a historic and cultural district. Some of our important historical assets, you know, precede when it was called Chinatown as the South Cove. We still have many remaining historic assets like the 19th century brick row houses, the first Old Quincy School, which was the first elementary school to have divided grade classrooms, the Maryknoll Sister Center, St. James the Greater, the Denison House, which was a women-led settlement house, as well as all of the Chinese historical sites, the historic laundries, the first Chinese restaurant, the historic streetscapes. People like Amelia Earhart, who lived on Tyler Street, Sun Yat-sen, the first president of Chinatown, who frequented and raised the money for the war efforts. Khalil Gibran, the poet, lived in the settlement house. And there are important chapters of labor history, women's history, and immigrant history. All of that have been written in Chinatown. So I think that historic districts are an important way to do this, but we need to update the way that we see these historic districts. It cannot only be about architecture. Historic preservation is also about preserving neighborhoods, and especially our working class neighborhoods and communities of color. In order to do this, a lot of times people of color have seen landmark districts as a factor in gentrification and displacement. But we see it as an important opportunity, and I think that it's time for us to create a new designation of a neighborhood conservation district, which is similar to the architectural conservation district idea, but more holistic. I think zoning, other parts of zoning have an important role to play, and public art as well, which is why we're looking at a project to put Chinese worker statues, not only statues of European and Eurocentric generals, but also statues of, the laundrymen, the garment workers, the people who built the city as immigrant labor, and to create an immigrant history trail that documents all of those different waves of history. And I'll just cut it short because I know Rodney needs to speak after me.
Thank you, Lydia.
And I will send you written.
Yes, submit the slides, please. And for everyone else, if people can just take a minute and then send me your written testimony, we'll make sure it gets circulated to all counselors. I am sorry about this rush at the end. We're going next to Rodney, and then it'll be Martha McNamara. Rodney?
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Councilor Janey, Councilor Mejia. Imagine for just a moment that we're doing a walking tour through Roxbury from where I'm from, and you go specifically to research Henry Hampton, whose house is in Roxbury. And
yeah, I'm going to tune in and I'm going to be gracious.
1 second, Kathy, you're not muted. Sorry. Rodney, please continue.
Hello? Oh,
yes,
good.
Go ahead.
Okay, and imagine for a moment that you go there specifically to look for the iconic garages, in fact, that represent so much of his work on Eyes on the Prize and that sort of thing, and that they're not there. And I think the point was made, whose history are we talking about? And I think that's a perfect example of things that that are essentially not being protected, and how to, I think Byron's point that we're not telling the truth effectively in a lot of these processes and procedures like Article 85 aren't doing a good job at telling the truth, because you can imagine if we're celebrating revolutionary history, for instance, if we were to go to the sandpipe, it would still be there. And so that's the point. I mean, we got to rethink, I think, how we protect a lot of these sites. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rodney. And thank you for the other materials you sent. Next up, Martha McNamara, and then it'll be Carissa DeMoore. Martha?
Hi, thanks. I'm going to be very brief because I know we're getting to the end here. I'm an architectural historian and preservationist. I've been active in the preservation community in Boston for over 35 years, former member of the Beacon Hill Architectural Commission. I'm also the co-chair of Revolutionary Spaces, which, as we've heard before from Nat Shidley, is a new cultural organization that stewards the Old State House and the Old South Meeting House. I want to underscore the important points that Boston's preservation policies and processes really need to be changed. They need to be updated. It's really resulting in a loss of a tremendous amount of our historic and cultural resources. And in part because we don't have enough attention paid to ordinary buildings, right? It's not just the iconic buildings in our city that tell the story, but actually ordinary streetscapes, ordinary landscapes, ordinary neighborhoods can help us tell a much broader, much deeper, and much more diverse story about the history of our city. I just want to end too by saying that I think Byron Rushing, who I greatly respect for all sorts of reasons, has challenged us rightly to think about why we are celebrating these anniversaries. And I think we have to carry that forward. But I do think that this is an extraordinary opportunity for us to leverage those 250th anniversaries that most people will be familiar with for a greater good. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Kenzie, for doing this.
Thank you so much, Martha. Next up, Carissa, and then it'll be Susan Bronner. And I do want to acknowledge we were joined by my colleague, Councillor Sabi George, who is supposed to be chairing the hearing that should have started 5 minutes ago. So grateful to her for her forbearance, and that's why we're rushing through here. Carissa.
Sure. Councilors, thank you for this really excellent conversation today. It's been wonderful. And I will keep my comments as brief as I can and follow up with you all in writing. I'm representing Historic New England, which owns and operates the Otis House on Cambridge Street. Historic New England just wants to say that the historic building stock across Boston is an asset to be leveraged, not just on anniversaries or building by building, but of course at a city scale. Old buildings are of course often aesthetically appealing and they have cultural significance, but Boston's historic places are also a tool for equity and social justice, as we've been discussing. They are critical to climate resiliency efforts because they were built to last. Historic preservation supports a diverse built environment, which in turn supports economic diversity, small minority and women-owned businesses, and retains high quality, affordable housing stock. Old buildings also help to create dense, walkable communities and vibrant streetscapes that benefit residents and of course bring in tourism. So looking ahead, there must be stronger proactive partnerships between decision makers, historic preservation professionals, and community leaders to ensure that diverse neighborhoods have access to historic preservation tools. That includes undertaking context studies, the types of survey that inform planning and policy decisions, ensuring inclusive criteria for landmarking and creating historic districts, allowing communities to use historic preservation as a tool to mitigate the negative impacts of redevelopment on their neighborhoods. And it includes financial incentives for lower income property owners, things like a local historic preservation tax credit or access to CPA dollars to offset preservation maintenance costs. It also means ensuring that City of Boston staff across many departments appreciate historic preservation issues and benefits and can dedicate staff resources to the kind of community engagement that supports preservation outcomes. Thank you again for today's conversation about this. As we approach the Sestercentennial anniversary, we look forward to continued dialogue with the city and others to strengthen and expand historic preservation and the vitality of our local neighborhoods.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Next up is Susan Bronner, and then it'll be Sarah Friedman. Susan?
Thank you. I had not signed up to talk. I have enjoyed this whole afternoon and most informative, so thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Sarah?
Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank Byron Rushing and Rodney and others and echo their thoughts about thinking of this as a catalyst for our history, but thinking about how to be sensitive moving forward. 3 quick comments. I really appreciated hearing from the out-of-towners and kind of get some comparison of what's happening in California or nationwide. Maybe give us incentive to raise the bar. Personally, I used to run the Boston Marathon, and my running friends from around the country would come and stay at my house, like a 1-bedroom condo. I'd have 8 visitors and sleeping bags on the floor. And it struck me how much they would comment, wow, they love driving around Boston, and seeing that it isn't just a cookie cutter like every other city that has the same chain stores everywhere. And they love the old architecture. And sadly, as people have pointed out, it's a tough struggle to hold on to some of those. I'd like to know, not today, but on the demolition delay, to me, if it's only postponing the inevitable, it's just adding stress to the people who care. And I'm curious what % of those delays are successful in changing the outcome of, meaning not demolition. And last, in 2004, if anyone was involved in public issues when the Democratic Convention was in Boston, there was something called Plant Yourself in the Park Day. And the delegates from across the country were going to be in every neighborhood for dinners and tours and things. And it was a citywide effort that every neighborhood would get money. There were a lot of donors, but it was coordinated by the Green Space Alliance. And it was like, poof. And I know historic preservation is more expensive and harder, but I would love to see something comparable, not just for an anniversary, but in general, to recognize our history. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And with that, we conclude public comment. And I just really want to thank my colleague, Councillor Mejia, for being here for the whole time, and for all the other councillors who joined, Councillor Janey, Councillor Asabi George, Councillor Flynn, Councillor Braden, Councillor Baker. And I really want to thank the historic preservation community for coming out in force, to Greg and Kathy and Leslie and Brianna, for speaking from that perspective, and for the folks who spoke on the commemoration, Jean-Luc, Leon, Jonathan, and Nat. I know that each of these panels, we could have mined your insight for hours on end. And so again, I'm just really grateful for you to be here to start the conversation with us. And to the administration, Kate Davis has been on the whole time, John McColgan, David Leonard, and I really appreciate the insight from Lynn Smilage and Chris Cook and from Michael Canizzo. I think we've started a bunch of great conversations today. I think, again, I appreciate Byron Rushing's challenge, and I think the idea of commemoration and broadening our conversation here is the right one. So I appreciate that. And I, again, want to thank everybody. And lastly, thank again my colleague, Councillor Asabi George, for her forbearance. If you are watching and you have come for the education hearing, it is about to start. And with this, on behalf of Councillor, go ahead, yeah.
Just Councillor Brock, before you adjourn this meeting, we will take probably a 15-minute recess so that central staff can log off and then log back on for our education hearing.
Perfect. Okay, so it's a 15-minute recess, and that's a great reminder to give the greatest thanks to central staff who picks up the pieces when councillors like myself overschedule us. So thank you, Councillor Asabi George, and all of central staff. And with that, on behalf of Councillor Baker, I am adjourning this hearing of the Committee on Arts, Culture, and Special Events. Thank you all.
So Candace, do you want me to log off, or shall I sit here and just wait, which I'm happy to do?
We actually have an entirely different link, so
Okay.
we do have to shut this particular one down.
Perfect.
And IT has to switch things out.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So I will see
Thank
you soon. You're welcome.